and now the books are being made into films.
Yes, they've made Dr. No already, and it's been a tremendous success in England, and even more of a success, I think, in America, where it's opened several weeks ago, where it's breaking records. They're now doing From Russia with Love, and I went out to see them in Istanbul, see the unit at work, and I was tremendously impressed with the casting and the way the script had been written, and I think it's going to be an equal success.
They're going to do the whole James Bond canon.
They've got an option on doing all the books, yes, one after another.
Bond.
Recently, I've felt inspired to review all of the James Bond movies, and rather than doing a video on each film, I figured I may as well toss them all into one massive video. In this review, I'll cover the 24 Eon-released Bond films, the 1 TV anthology film, the 2 theatrical non-Eon films, and a bonus unofficial theatrically released film I can only describe as a fan film spin-off of Bonds that I find interesting, making 28 films in total. At the time I'm writing this, it's probably about 2 months before I actually managed to release this. Since this is sure to be pretty long, I will be timestamping each film, so if you need a break from this video and want to come back, or you just want to see my thoughts on certain films in this massive franchise, you can pick and choose in the description, or you can simply scroll through and select a point by point on the time bar, if you're watching this on desktop. Anyhow, I have a long history with James Bond, though I would consider myself a pretty passive fan. I don't own all the movies, though I'm sure I will through the course of this video, and I haven't seen them all to this point. Though I have seen at least one film from each core actor in the franchise, and have probably seen in the ballpark of about 15 of these films, though for many of them it has been so long my recollection of the film is murky at best. I do keep up with these films as they come out, having watched every film released since Casino Royale in theaters. Basically what I'm trying to get at is this will be a mostly first impression review of each film, at least from a more critical-eyed adult, rather than me as a 10-year-old or whenever I watched them previously. I'll also note that I'm not super aware of what films are considered good or bad. I know people dislike Moonraker from the Zeitgeist, and I know people like Skyfall and Goldeneye. Outside of that, I won't be influenced too much from the core Bond community. With that said, my taste also tends to differ from a lot of people's when it comes to film, so it may be interesting to see my takes and how they compare with the larger fandom. I think I'm most excited to watch the Timothy Dalton films again, because I remember not loving those as a kid, but I think they may grow on me, as by my understanding they're pretty grounded in reality compared to the other films. In terms of continuity, I'm not going to pick apart each film too much based on that, since the majority of these films are only loosely connected. I'll try to keep each review fairly brief, but with that said, I suppose I should jump right into the first Bond film, Casino Royale, 1954. This film was made as a result of a deal between CBS and Ian Fleming to adapt his novel series James Bond, and would lead to CBS being interested in airing a TV show based on the character, which never came to be, though the stories were written and would end up being adapted into a series of short stories later published in the novel For Your Eyes Only. As a child, I remember finding this somewhere on the internet and not really caring for it, but honestly, for what it is, it's actually pretty good and had me invested from start to finish. Unfortunately, the ending is a bit abrupt.
Give me the check. Huh? Come on. Call the police.
So I was kind of clamoring for an epilogue because I was so invested in the plot, but anyways, here we go with the story. James Bond is a CIA agent rather than an agent of British intelligence as he's traditionally portrayed, and he's tasked with defeating Le Chiffre, Let's go with that. A communist who's been using funds from his organization to gamble. They essentially get into a game of baccarat and Bond wins, but his love interest Valerie is threatened as a result, with Le Chevalier trying to steal the winnings. They're both captured but manage to break free and kill Chevalier. While the plot of the special is fairly simple and certainly not as action-packed as the Eon Bond films tend to be, it's actually pretty engaging, and Barry Nelson plays James Bond pretty well despite being an American rather than a British person in the film. Apparently he didn't even read the source material, which makes his performance extra impressive because it's actually fairly close to what we'd see other actors do later, despite it being through an American lens rather than a British one. Meanwhile, legendary actor Peter Lorre put in a pretty good performance as Le Chiffre. The film isn't particularly impressively shot, being a fairly cheap television film, but it isn't shot bad and all the sets and stuff are nice. Is it super relevant today? I don't think so, especially with the book eventually being adapted by Eon itself through Daniel Craig's first film in 2006, but it's certainly worth a watch anyways for people who are curious of this oddity within the franchise, especially given its recent official release on YouTube through MGM and YouTube Movies. Dr. No is the first James Bond film from Eon, starring a fairly young Sean Connery in his early 30s. It's also the first of 3 films directed by Terrence Young. This film's Bond acted as a pretty solid prototype of the Bond we'd see in the resulting decades. Sean really made the role his own. He's suave, clever, and cunning. He really feels like a point-of-view character for the audience in that he's fairly quiet and seems like he's kind of just along for the ride. And I like how he plays Bond in this film overall. This film takes a long time to really get going. Bond arrives in Kingston in Jamaica pretty early in the film, but we don't meet Honey Rider, his love interest, or Dr. No for that matter, until a fair way into the film. Honey is pretty much a non-character in this film, however she comes off as something of a femme fatale. Speaking on her rape at the hand of a man, she says she poisoned him to death slowly with a Black Widow spider.
I put a Black Widow spider underneath his mosquito net. A female, and they're the worst. It took him a whole week to die.
It's clear she can stand up for herself, and that said, it also kind of brings in the, shall I say, dated elements of this film. On the flip side of that, we have a fair amount of diversity in this film, with Coral tagging along being a black man that Bond actually takes to and becomes allies with, though his death is a bit anticlimactic. It sort of plays like they just wanted a reason to get rid of him for the climax. And Dr. No is an Asian scientist who isn't played to be Fu Manchu-ish, though it is worth noting that Joseph Wiseman, his actor, is Canadian Jewish. Dr. No is threatening enough. With a robotic arm, he tries to interrupt a US rocket launch. He's a pretty good foil to Bond, being a suave villain with a superiority complex. That said though, his death and the entire climax is fairly underwhelming, just being a quiet and quaint fight against Bond. Though a lot of older action movies are a bit underwhelming by today's standards, bar pretty much North by Northwest, so I give it a pass. The theme originated here, which is a classic film theme song, up there with Star Wars, Jaws, and Indiana Jones's scores, though the rendition of the Three Blind Mice as the film's overall theme song was a bit odd. Though the film did have the gun barrel sequence at the start that would become a later staple of the franchise. Other franchise regulars like M, played by Bernard Lee, Monty Penny, played by Lois Maxwell, and Q, who was played by Peter Burton, who would only play the role once before Desmond Llewellyn's long run, appear on screen for the first time in this film. Overall, while this doesn't have a crazy spectacle of future Bond films and is a bit of a slow burn, it has the DNA of the future Bond films in it that we'd eventually come to love, so I'd recommend giving this one a watch for that reason. The second Sean Connery Bond film, From Russia with Love, follows Bond on a mission to steal a Russian decoder in Turkey. After stealing the decoder and meeting our new Bond girl Tatiana Romanov along with the informant Ali Bey, Bond has to try to deliver the decoder safely home with Russians and deadly assassin Red Grant sent by Spectre on his trail. This film seems to add a lot more elements we have come to know from Bond. For example, while I feel Dr. No's title wasn't too unlike Bond's typical trippy openings, this one falls straight in line, being a woman dancing with a colorful cast and crew credits being projected onto her. It looks great and was filmed amazingly. The song created for this movie, From Russia with Love, by Matt Monro, falls in line very well with what we come to expect from these films. and does a great job fitting the vibe this film gives off. It also has a really nice fake out at the start where it looks like Bond has died, but it turns out that that was just a body decoy. It's pretty interesting, as this being the second film, audiences may not expect him to actually live through the entire movie. Connery has really come into his own as Bond even more, and it's perfectly clear from watching him here why he's synonymous with the role. Interestingly, we get our first kind of gadget sequence with the suitcase. It's not bonkers stuff we would see in the more Brosnan eras, but it's definitely headed in that direction. This also marks Desmond Llewellyn's first turn as Q, a role he would hold until Die Another Day. It's interesting to see how this film used Bond's score as well. Modern Bond films seem to use it in key action moments, where this film kind of just uses it when there's dead air. For example, in Istanbul, Bond gets his hotel room and checks for bugs, while the Bond theme blasts overpoweringly. I don't really mind, it's kind of a nitpick, but it's certainly different from the modern Bond films. The action is improved from the first, mostly due to the raised budget, and I'll say the gypsy fight feels a lot like a Western movie. It isn't super realistic to how a gunfight of that magnitude would go, but obviously it keeps the film's pace up with the old technology, and I get it. His climatic fight with Red is much better than his bout with Dr. No, though. I like the dynamic of the two of them kind of trying to outspy each other until an impressive for its age final fight happens. And is it just me, or could Daniel Craig play Red in a remake of this movie? They look fairly similar to me, which is moderately amusing. I liked the stuff on the train, it felt super Hitchcock-ish, and is sort of an uncommon setting to see these days, but adds a lot to the suspense in the horror, mystery, and spy genres, as you're essentially stuck on a massive object with little escape. To add to that, the helicopter sequence was pretty clearly inspired by North by Northwest. I haven't read the book to see if that was in there as well, but clearly how it was shot and how it was scored is very similar to the airplane sequence from that film. I'm not complaining though, because the sequence was great in North by Northwest, and it was done pretty well here too. Perhaps my biggest gripe is with Tatiana. She feels pretty meh to me. She's a little dumber and less independent than Honey, and she really doesn't do much but stand there and look attractive. Overall, From Russia with Love improves in a lot of aspects over the previous film being more action-oriented. Sean Connery is absolutely coming into his own as the character, and this film for me has a more satisfying villain than in Dr. No, though I will concede that the Bond girl isn't as good as the last. Goldfinger again follows Sean Connery as James Bond, with Guy Hamilton directing the first of his 4 films in the series, and this is the film where the series, for better or worse, fully found the formula. Over-the-top villains, over-the-top plans, full gadget sequence, a theme song that plays over the titles, henchmen, a death trap scene, and even the trademark Aston Martin Bond is known for, is found in this film for the first time. The plot of the film basically follows Bond as he meets a woman, Jill Masterson, and ends up foiling Goldfinger's attempt at cheating in poker. In retaliation, Goldfinger turns Jill into a golden woman, an image synonymous with the franchise at this point. Anyways, Bond decides he's going to find out about Goldfinger, eventually stumbling upon one of his hideouts in Switzerland. After leaving a tracker on his car where he learns of an Operation Jackpot, he ends up stumbling upon a girl named Tilly, who as it turns out is the sister of Jill, and they are detected, and Tilly is killed by Oddjob, Goldfinger's main henchman. After this, Bond is taken to Kentucky, where through some snooping he learns of Goldfinger's plan to destroy Fort Knox and raise the value of gold. Bond is taken to Fort Knox, where they intend to knock out soldiers with gas and nuke the place. But Goldfinger's plan goes awry when his pilot, Pussy Galore, ends up betraying him and reporting this to the military, so Goldfinger's crew and the military get into a battle. The bomb is disarmed, and Bond is sent on a plane to meet the president, but as it turns out, the plane was stolen by Goldfinger with a hostage, Pussy Galore. Bond manages to kill Goldfinger, but the plane crashes, leading to Bond and Pussy making love while lampooned in a forest. Honestly, this was a pretty decent film. I like Oddjob, he's a pretty fun henchman, and certainly provides a good challenge for Bond, and would pave the way for other characters like Jaws further down the line. On a similar note, Pussy Galore isn't that bad, but is the most underutilized Bond girl to date, essentially just being an evil girl who shows up every 20 minutes until her and Bond's frankly uncomfortable and quite rapey love scene. Apparently, Bond was such a good lover that she decided to switch sides despite, being about to fucking nuke Fort Knox. There's a fairly uncomfortable part where Bond slaps a girl's ass and says this is man's business towards the start of the film.
Dink, say goodbye to Felix. Man talk.
I know it was a different time, but it still feels shocking that just 50 years ago this was seen as normal. Goldfinger is probably the best villain in the series so far. He really feels like a real-life corporate criminal, at least that's how he's played. Most corporate criminals in real life tend not to try to nuke Fort Knox or turn women into gold, and that is certainly worth noting about the film. The previous two films felt fairly grounded, where this film certainly seems to lean into a more campy angle of Bond, which you can take how you will. The theme song is fantastic, Goldfinger performed by Shirley Bassey. This is a song that I've had in my head since I first saw this movie at about age 8, and while most plot beats, bar the laser scene and Golden Woman, have mostly left my brain with the passage of time, this song I remember vividly to this day, and in my eyes is one of the most memorable songs in the series. Thunderball is probably my least favorite of the Bonds I've seen up to this point. It kind of feels removed from the wider Connery series at points. For example, much like the last entry in the series, the film had a little opening mini-adventure. At the end of this segment, James Bond uses a fucking jetpack to escape. I wouldn't really mind this in a more Bond film because, as we'll soon cover, his series is a little more zany than Connery's take, but besides a few moments of over-the-top shenanigans in Goldfinger, Connery's take up to this point has been fairly grounded. I will say the rest of this film kind of dials back the silliness a bit, which I think is more fitting in this portion of the Bond series. Anyways, the plot goes as follows. Bond learns of a plot by Spectre to threaten two major cities with nuclear weapons unless the UN pays the group £100 million. So Bond sets off to Nassau, where he learns of Emilio Largo's plot and uncovers the location of the bombs, and the fact that they plan to blow up Miami if the ransom isn't met. Anyhow, an underwater battle ensues, then Largo tries to flee in his yacht, but the film's Bond girl Domino ends up killing him. The film has a solid enough story with decent action, but where it really lacks is in the characters. The villain Emilio is fine, if a little dull, but the henchman Fiona is kind of just a dull villain woman who sleeps with Bond and basically just fucks off. On top of that, Domino is fine, but she just kind of lacks a solid charisma or a reason to care about her much. She's basically just sad her brother dies, so she betrays Emilio. In a lot of ways, she's like Honey from Dr. No, but less good. Connery as Bond is fine, but he seems a little more out of it and bored of the series, where in comparison from Russia with Love and Dr. No, it seemed like he was having a pretty big go at it. Not that I really mind, his performance is still good since he pretty much embodies this version of the character. I thought the stakes were a little weak too, since they more or less were just going to have to pay Spectre when the nukes are placed. Worst case scenario, if Bond fails, they just pay Spectre and Spectre doesn't launch off the nukes. It's not like this plot would unravel MI6 or anything. If a film doesn't have stakes, I can't really be emotionally attached, and this film seems to kind of fail to deliver that. The underwater battle was cool along with the other underwater stuff, but after a while it got a bit boring because underwater action will naturally be pretty slow paced when compared to normal action. But the underwater fight was still overall a pretty good time. Finally, the opening scene was cool with the women swimming. It kind of deviated from what we saw in the last two films, and I liked it quite a bit. The song Thunderball, performed by Tom Jones, was okay. It's not bad by any means, but it isn't a classic like other Bond themes. Anyway, that brings us to our first non-Eon production released theatrical Bond film, Casino Royale. Casino Royale is a pretty interesting case when it comes to the Bond franchise. Released a mere 2 months before Connery's next entry, You Only Live Twice, and being the second adaptation of Casino Royale. This film is a comedy film from Columbia Pictures, starting production before Connery's run began all the way back in 1957. Early adaptations played the film fairly straight, however the film dissolved into this, so not to compete with the MGM series going on at the same time. The film had a budget of $12 million, which made it, at the point of release, least the most expensive Bond adaptation to this point. Talking about the plot in a video with only brief summaries of each film will be hard, so I'll talk about it very generally. Basically, the film stars an older James Bond, played by David Niven. After the death of M, he's tasked with taking over the 00 program and stop a mysterious threat. Basically, a bunch of these segments happen, one loosely following the plot of Casino Royale, in which Orson Welles plays Le Chiffre. However, the main plot really follows the evil doings of Jimmy Bond, the original James Bond's nephew, who was corrupted by being shafted and feeling inferior to the legacy of his uncle. Anyways, everyone in the 00 program becomes James Bond 007, so basically we follow the adventure of each.
Congratulations, 007.
And you, 007, sir. Good hunting, 007.
This film is very bizarre, and you can see where the massive budget went into this film. It legitimately looks really good, the humor is pretty dated and incredibly horny.
How old are you?
17.
But the actors still all bring great performances, especially David Niven as Bond proper. The biggest problem is the long and drawn out plot, mostly being hugely unfocused and making the film have great parts and horrible parts. The first 30 minutes where Bond is with M's family is a slog, but the Casino Royale part, as well as the part in Berlin, are legitimately great. In a lot of ways, this film walked so Austin Powers could run, and that's particularly evident in the final segment with our characters fighting Jimmy Bond, which looks a lot like a set piece you might see in Austin Powers or a Mel Brooks movie. Overall, it's interesting and worth checking out if you're interested in a very 60s, very psychedelic Bond film that is, while not totally coherent, is at least interesting and visually stimulating. But if you go in expecting a Bond film, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. James Bond's STD contracting journey continues in You Only Live Twice, directed by Lewis Gilbert, who would direct 3 films in the franchise and not return until the middle of Roger Moore's tenure. This film has a lot to love and a lot to hate, which ultimately makes it feel pretty mediocre in my eyes. This was Sean Connery's first of 3 swan songs in the part, but we'll get back to that as we go along. So perhaps it's fitting that Bond finally matches wits with Blofeld himself, the leader of Spectre, who has been behind the evil schemes we've seen from the start. The plot of this one is that James Bond fakes his death to go undercover and unravel a conspiracy on why a series of American and Russian rockets were stolen from space. Yes, it's starting to have a very Roger Moore era feel by this point. Anyways, Bond learns that the rocket stealing, the other rockets, keeps landing near Japan, so he heads out there to meet Aki and Tetsuro, agents for the Japanese Secret Service. They end up tracing the rocket's activities to Mr. Osato and his assistant Helga. After being captured by the pair, Bond manages to escape, leading to the execution of Helga. Meanwhile, Bond is training at Aki's ninja school, where he makes a romantic connection with Aki, but she's killed in the night. For some reason, there are modern gun-toting ninjas as well, something I googled to see if this was a real thing, and as far as I know, it's not. No worries on Aki's death though, because they dress up in racist Mr. Yunioshi from Breakfast at Tiffany's-esque get-up. Another comparison is Stinky Dinky from The Pest.
Nice lady, I'm hiding, I'm sexy, but I'm hiding.
And while I wouldn't put it on those levels of racist, I mean, it's still not the best look. Anyways, Bond can't go an entire 40 minutes without a new love interest, so Aki's replaced with Kissy, and they raid the islands that Blofeld is hiding on. Bond sends Kissy to get backup, and a fight ensues, with Bond eventually blowing up Blofeld's rocket, and Blofeld narrowly escaping, blowing up the base. Honestly, I don't really love this film. I'm fine with the campy Bond, but Connery doesn't feel entirely comfortable in the role and seems to take it less serious. I think this is his worst performance yet, though I maintain it still isn't that bad. I really liked the helicopter fight scene with Bond on his little baby helicopter fighting 4 other helicopters. Hell, the action in general is top notch in this one compared to the previous entries, and the opening credits were cool as always, with a song that's nice, albeit a bit plain, performed by Nancy Sinatra, the daughter of Frank Sinatra. And while Blofeld is a good villain, due to him needing to be revealed to the audience at the same time as Bond near the end of the film, he's a little undercooked in this film at least, and his defeat feels a little easy as a result, despite the epic battle happening around our hero. I like the Japanese setting, and honestly wished I liked the story more, as it was written by Roald Dahl of Willy Wonka fame, of all people. I almost feel his writing style would have fit a more surreal Bond adventure than what we ultimately got here. Honestly, I won't call it bad, but it's flawed enough that it doesn't really hold up to previous Connery entries. Okay, so in doing this video, I've gone down a number of rabbit holes in my research, and eventually I ended up on a page about knockoff Bond films on Wikipedia. And while I normally wouldn't cover these things, this film is almost too crazy not to talk about. I thought about giving it its own video eventually, but decided against it. Simultaneously a rip-off, spin-off, unofficial entry, and fan film in the series, Operation Kid Brother stars Neil Connery, a non-actor brother of Sean Connery, as James Bond's brother in a spoof where he plays a hypnotist, plastic surgeon, lip-reading, archer, and implied brother of James Bond. Interestingly, this film stars numerous Bond veterans, which is surprisingly common, seeing as Casino Royale, which also released in '67, had a handful of these stars as well in the film. We have Daniela Biaggi from Russia with Love, Adolfo Celi, who was in Thunderball, Anthony Dawson, who played the Blofeld's stand-in in several Bond films, Bernard Lee, who played M up until Moonraker, and Lois Maxwell, who played Moneypenny up till A View to a Kill. I guess Titanus, that distributed the film, just tossed money at the thing in the hopes of making a congruent Bond knockoff series. Lois Maxwell was quoted as saying she made more on this film than all of her other 14 outings as Moneypenny combined. Interestingly, Sean Connery was pretty understandably mad that his co-stars, especially Maxwell, starred in the film, which was ultimately a rip-off of his franchise, but ended up forgiving Maxwell after she guided Neil through the press process, so not to have him look foolish. And even Neil Connery was only hired because the producer heard him talking on the radio about how he was fired from his plastering job for losing his tools, which was a tabloided story due to the fame of his brother. Speaking of Connery, in the English release, he's dubbed by an American because he's getting medical treatment at the time of the dub, meaning one of the biggest reasons producers hired him, from hearing his voice, which was strikingly similar to Sean's, wasn't even shown in likely the most commonly viewed dub of the film.
We've got to find Thanatos' headquarters. Now, the radioactive rugs were made at the factory. Where were they sent?
Yeah, like a fortune in buried chocolate cheeseburgers.
If this is supposed to be James Bond's brother, why does he sound like Casey Kasem from Scooby-Doo? Names in this film are changed, but people like Lois Maxwell were clearly supposed to play the characters they made famous in the real Bond films.
Shuko was right. You can see the resemblance.
Think so? I'm not so sure of that, really. I don't think he's quite so good looking.
You never take me to dinner looking like this, James. You never take me to dinner, period.
This film was distributed by United Artists in the United States, which also distributed Bond at the time, which makes it a further interesting ripoff. Connery would go on to re-enter the plastering business, which he continued doing until the early 80s, and Mystery Science Theater 3000 would riff on this movie during their show. Also, don't worry, for brevity, and because this is the only Bondsploitation film I feel is relevant to the series, this will be the only one I will cover in this review. If you want to see more though, there are plenty, so let me know, and I can try to review a few more in the future. With all of that strange context out of the way, how about we get into the film itself? Honestly, it isn't the worst movie. The film has weird moments, but mostly just feels like an unauthorized, somewhat strange spin-off of the Bond films. So basically, Neil is a plastic surgeon who is going to a conference when Miss Yashoki, the girlfriend of a deceased agent, is kidnapped at his conference, and a man ends up dead, which is blamed on Connery. However, he is recruited by Commander Cunningham, played by Bernard Lee, who, let's face it, is just M, and his assistant, Miss Maxwell, who, again, let's face it, is just Moneypenny. Anyways, they're trying to find Mr. Thayer, played by Adolfo Celi, who is your typical Bond villain. He is also who kidnapped Yashuko. Anyways, he works for Thanatos, which is basically a Spectre type organization. Neil eventually finds Yashuko, who tells him of Thanatos' plan, which is basically to wipe out all mechanical objects with a giant magnet. Sadly for us, and not for Connery, Yashuko dies, along with a henchwoman Connery repeatedly flirts with, and he walks over their corpses like nothing happened. Connery wants out, but Cunningham is like, no.
I'm sorry, but this time you'll have to work it out for yourselves. I am a surgeon, not a secret agent.
From now on, you're a reserve officer recalled to Her Majesty's active service.
Anyways, he scopes out the factory where the magnet is being built by blind people who are dying from radiation, and Connery gets captured, only to break out by hypnotizing the guy, right from Star Wars styles.
You will remove these restraints and leave the cell with the door open.
Anyhow, Connery arranges a coup with the numerous girls that Thayer has, and they flee to attack Thayer's base with the help of Connery's Scottish archery buddies. They fight and Thayer dies. Cunningham wants Connery to join Her Majesty's Secret Service, but he's kind of like, no.
I'd be happy to have you back in the reserves with the rank of major.
You would?
and hypnotizes him into fucking off while he gets his brother's sloppy seconds. The end. As I said, I don't hate this film. It's really give and take, and I wouldn't really consider this much of a parody film. The performances are pretty cool from all the Bond veterans, like Alfaldo as Thayer, Maxwell as Miss Maxwell, and everyone else, of course. I like that Monty Penny has more to do in this film, getting in the action a bit, akin to what we'd see the character do later in Skyfall. Hell, Neil Connery isn't that bad. From the miming we can see on screen, I wish he dubbed his own lines, because this Casey Kasem knockoff that voiced him ain't it.
Or we might ruin everything.
At least get a sound alike. I mean, Neil looks kind of like Sean, but if you're gonna get him, go all the way and wait for him to recover from his medical issues, then have him do the film dub so the audience can get the knockoff they were promised. On that note, the dub is bad and the lips almost never match up. The villain plot is pretty weak, but it feels like something we may have seen in one of the weaker Bond films, and Alfaldo does a pretty good job with the material. The ending also felt very Bondish, with them storming a castle with the Scottish archers and getting in this big brawl. It's actually pretty similar to what we just saw in You Only Live Twice. Hell, Connery killing the villain with his bow and arrow works because that was set up as one of his 4 skills: lip reader, plastic surgeon, hypnotist, and archer. So I liked all that, and I can't say the Scottish Archer Squad is too crazy, especially since Bond raided Blofield's base in the last film with a team of fucking ninjas.
100 of my ninjas will slide in unseen.
The score is basically the Bond score, very lightly changed for legal reasons. That also goes for the Sang pop song too, which could have been tossed into a Bond film and fit fine, though the song is pretty bad admittedly. Honestly, how was this movie not sued? It took characters, actors, implied heavily that it's Bond's brother.
I'm the brother of Secret Agent 00.
Yes, so I've heard. A most disagreeable family.
You have Connery prominently in the title, just to sell off of Sean Connery's name. Like, this film wanted to start a plagiaristic Bond spin-off series. And with this film's plot not really even being much of a parody in my eyes, more of just a Bond-esque film. I think the closest modern equivalent is like Sony's Marvelverse, which is in the MCU but isn't, but at least that has some legal grounds as they have the rights to the Spider-Man characters, with Holland able to appear in both the MCU and the Spider-Verse. This is just buying stuff to make this as close as possible to Bond without being sued. I will say I appreciated this film as somewhat of a fish out of water tale and doesn't try to play it like the guy was this suave spy just like his unnamed but implied brother, though his skills he's incredibly good at, and they are interesting skills that I don't believe Bond has. And while he's kind of a ladies' man, he definitely doesn't have the copy-paste personality of Bond, which kind of surprises me. Honestly, as far as cheesy Bond clones go, I don't hate it. It is wildly interesting to me, so if you're a big Bond fan, I recommend this the same way I recommend the 54 and 67 Casino Royales, as an interesting side piece in Bond's lore, but not essential viewing. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is the first and only Bond adventure where our titular hero is portrayed by George Lazenby. It's also the only film directed by Peter R. Hunt. Lazenby is also the only Bond actor in the official Eon canon that played Bond only one time, with the next closest being Timothy Dalton, who only appeared in 2 Bond films. Ironically, Dalton was actually the one originally approached for the role, but he figured he was too young to play the role, ultimately not playing it until 18 years later in 1987. Then Eon flirted with the idea of having Roger Moore, who wasn't picked until 1973. George Lazenby essentially conned his way into the part. Interestingly enough, if you want to hear that story, I recommend watching Becoming Bond on Hulu. The film itself is actually fantastic, and probably the best Bond film I've seen so far in my opinion. It has the right amount of action to keep it engaging, but it never slips into the realm of being overly comical in my eyes. Lazenby as Bond is fantastic, and while his performance is wholly unique and not really stealing from Connery that much, it's still fantastic. And even in this marathon session, it didn't take me long to accept him as Bond. The plot goes as follows. Bond is taken off the Blofeld case, essentially failing to capture him after a long period of time. But Bond isn't giving up that easy and cracks a bargain to marry Mark DeMarco's daughter, Tracy, if he gives him clues to the location of Blofeld. Tracy refuses, but convinces her dad to give Bond the plans, though they fall in love during a cheesy montage to this Randy Newman-esque song, which is equally cheesy. This eventually leads him to Blofeld's lab on top of a ski resort where he's brainwashing several girls into releasing a virus on the population. This hits home pretty hard in 2020. and Bond undercover tries to shutter this operation. Blofeld sees through Bond's disguise, though, and he has to escape. When he gets to the bottom of the mountain, he runs into Tracy, who helps him get away, and they hide in a barn where Bond asks her to marry him. She agrees, but once again they're found and pursued. This time Tracy is captured. So Bond calls in a favor and manages to destroy Blofeld's lab and save Tracy, but Blofeld escapes. After this, Bond and Tracy are married, but as they're leaving to their honeymoon, Tracy is shot dead.
There's no hurry, you see. We have all the time in the world.
I have to admit, this is a pretty tragic ending to the film. Bond finds this woman that makes him happy, and he'll finally live a normal life, but sadly that's cut short because his spying lifestyle catches up to him. I like Tracy in this film, though her character's naturally pretty rushed, going from essentially being a casual lover to Bond's wife and then dying all in one film. Though she is a pretty active Bond girl, which I enjoy, Diana Rigg plays off Lazenby very well. The continuity in this film is pretty messed up, as I don't know if they fully agreed upon how to attach the larger Connery series to this film. Bond quips about the other guy towards the start, obviously a nod to Connery's Bond.
This never happened to the other fella.
Blofeld and Bond, who met in the last film, meet face to face and don't recognize each other.
I am Ernst Stavro Blofeld. They told me you were assassinated in Hong Kong.
Yes, this is my second life.
Originally, Bond was going to undergo plastic surgery, which would explain the actor change, and Blofeld was also going to undergo plastic surgery. But since that plotline was cut at some point, this causes it to not make much sense at all why they don't recognize each other. On the flip side, this film also maintains its continuity, showing tidbits from previous adventures in the opening, which has pretty cool effects. We also see Bond's relationships with M, Q, and Moneypenny go unchanged. Ultimately, though, I consider the changes between actors, directors, and writers in these early films to not matter that much. The Craig Bond, for example, is a much more stable continuity, with the films tying into each other more, so it matters a little more to me there. But here, I can overlook issues with continuity. The Bond score has a pretty weak reprisal in this film towards the start, though they do remedy this by playing the original during the climax. Finally, the action is fantastic, whether it be the car race through the derby track, the ski segment, or even the ending bobsled fight. It's all amazing and well done, and it doesn't strike me as overtly campy. Overall, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a fun ride with a lot of cool moments, which falls more onto the grounded side of the series, which I personally prefer over the over-the-top stuff. Diamonds Are Forever was Sean Connery's first return to the James Bond role after Lazenby quit the role, feeling that Bond would be out of date in the 70s, and the fact that Eon wanted to sign him for a 7-picture deal, which would most likely land him in the 80s before his tenure as the character would finally conclude. It is also the return of director Guy Hamilton. After some deliberation, Eon decided to try to hook Connery in for one more entry, which they ended up doing for $2 million, which was astronomical for an actor in the early 70s, though we know now that figure's pretty well dwarfed. Diamonds Are Forever, in a way, is seen as more of a sequel to You Only Live Twice than On Her Majesty's Secret Service, with almost no reference to that film. This further adds to the credence of needing to just go with it in this film franchise rather than digging into the continuity. The film itself is fine, but feels a little bit awkward, though honestly. This is definitely getting to the campier era of Bond with Roger Moore, who, from my understanding, had more campier films. And I don't think Connery's Bond works as well for that environment. Personally, I prefer adventures like Dr. No, From Russia with Love, or Goldfinger, his more down-to-earth adventures, relatively. It really feels like the Bond brand was pivoting away from Connery's Bond, so it kind of makes sense why he left. That's not to say he was bad by any means in this film. I definitely prefer his performance in this to the one that we saw in You Only Live Twice, but still, it's worth pointing out anyways. Anyhow, the plot of this film follows Bond, who was put on an assignment to track down some stolen diamonds from South Africa since he had some downtime after the supposed death of Blofeld. Bond eventually ends up in Las Vegas, where he starts to unravel the conspiracy by Blofeld to use diamonds to create a super laser to blow up nukes, and eventually Washington, D.C. as well. Anyhow, Bond manages to stop this after a big fight ensues on this oil rig Blofeld is using as a cover to control the laser satellite from space. So yeah, the plot in this one's pretty cheesy, and that isn't really helped by our supporting cast. Our Bond girl in this one is Tiffany, and she's kind of a dumbass throughout the film, and is frankly kind of annoying. Her chemistry with Bond isn't really there either, making her at best forgettable, and at worst pretty eye-rolly. We have Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd as henchmen. I might be calling it early, but they're probably the worst in the series. They act like Three Stooges characters, and not in a good way. There are a few jokes early on implying that they're homosexuals, which isn't a bad thing at face value, but making these two gay men bumbling idiots is kind of weird. Once again, Blofeld is changed to this time be portrayed by Charles Gray. It wasn't the best Blofeld, but not bad. I kind of prefer the one from Her Majesty's Secret Service, but it's a pretty close call. I also liked the Vegas setting as well. It's not as exciting and exotic as most Bond films, but as one of the cities most synonymous for gambling in the world, it's a pretty fitting place for Bond to be, given his card-playing roots. The theme by Shirley Bassey is pretty great. She's also the one who did the theme for Goldfinger. The opening cinematic is also pretty fun as always. One thing that kind of bothers me is at the start, Bond thinks he kills Blofeld, and it's pretty campy, which directly after On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a pretty jarring change.
Welcome to hell, Blofeld.
It's Blofeld. Blofeld.
I mean, the last time we saw Bond, he was crying over the corpse of his dead wife, and then I turn on this film, and he's smiling, and all is well.
Welcome to hell, Blofeld.
This is a bit of an editor's note after recording the script, but if you watch something like Quantum of Solace, it's a much better follow-up handling Bond's emotions after losing a loved one. But truthfully, like I said, I kind of have to ignore the fact that On Her Majesty's Secret Service exists for this film to truly work, but that's kind of what you get with this franchise, I suppose. Live and Let Die is the first Bond film to star Roger Moore, who would hold the part for more films than any other Bond actor, at least officially, as Connery would reprise his role one more time in Never Say Never Again, which we'll cover pretty soon. Anyways, Live and Let Die is a weird film and certainly the product of its time. It's got a real blaxploitation vibe and feels more like a plot from a Shaft film than a Bond film. Basically, Bond is tasked with uncovering the death of a couple of agents and ends up going down this rabbit hole of voodoo-inspired heroin distributors. He ends up meeting and having sex with a girl named Solitaire, who is a tarot card reader for the villain, and they basically team up to bust the ring. They get in boat chases, Bond is almost eaten by alligators, and Bond saves Solitaire from a human sacrifice before Bond finally murders the villain, Mr. Big, by feeding him a bullet that makes him inflate like a balloon and explode. Yeah, this movie's pretty weird, but sadly not really in a good way. To tell you the truth, I didn't hate this film in a lot of ways, but also my feelings are pretty mixed on it mostly. In terms of the plot, it doesn't feel very Bondish. Up to this point in the Eon series, we've dealt with Blofeld and other villains from Spectre. Here it seems they kind of just pulled a heroin distributor out of their asses so they could have a blaxploitation plot rather than the more over-the-top supervillain plots. And the villain's plan doesn't track with me very well. He's going to give $1 billion worth of heroin to start a monopoly and add more heroin addicts, but the issue is, once his free supply of heroin dries up, people will just start selling it again, so he's not really going to have a monopoly on the industry. I don't know, it's kind of just lame and off-brand for Bond. Roger Moore does a pretty good job in the Bond role. I don't think he's fully there yet. He's still kind of searching for his identity as Bond, but I think he shows potential. He's just not quite where George Lazenby and Connery were on their first entries. It also could have been me just trying to adjust to Moore in this film with a weird off-brand plot, plus Moore's interpretation is far different than Connery's or Lazenby's before, which were relatively similar, even though they had their own twists to them. Solitaire's a good Bond girl, but far from my favorite. I like her enough though, and Rosie is kind of the fake-out Bond girl, was good too, though she kind of just came off as foolish, which made her less threatening when she betrayed Bond. Mr. Big was a strange villain, wearing a mask through a good portion of the movie, yet still being a bad guy, so I don't know what the twist was there. His death is kind of ridiculous, and his plan is pretty weak. Teehee is the main henchman, and he has a claw hand, which feels weird to me, in this otherwise street mafia-esque plot rather than mad scientist we see in the more standard Bond fare, but he was amusing enough. The one part of this film that really took me out of the film was the boat chase, though. The chase itself is great, but it introduces a character, Sheriff Pepper, and the other police officers of his town, and they're all kind of just hillbillies that do comic relief antics, and it just gets really old really quick, and completely pulled me out of the plot for the 20-ish minutes that they kind of just take over the film. The opening effects were good with the flaming skull and such, and I'm tempted to crown this the best opening credits so far. Live and Let Die by Paul McCartney and the Wings is also a classic Bond song in my opinion. Overall, I didn't really like Live and Let Die. I see potential in more, and I'm fine with the cheese and camp, which more seems to play into, and as long as his stories are focused and still feels like Bond in the future, I don't think I would mind him at all as a Bond. However, this film sadly didn't really meet those requirements. The Man with the Golden Gun was another wacky Bond movie. A bit of a return to form after the bizarre blaxploitation entry of Live and Let Die. The Man with the Golden Gun finds Bond in Hong Kong, hunting an infamous assassin, the Man with the Golden Gun, or Francisco Caramanga, who also happens to have stolen the Solace aggregator, which I guess will create solar energy Caramanga is trying to sell, which is bad. Anyways, hijinks ensues and he kills Caramanga in a funhouse, and he puts his henchman, Knick-Knack, in a cage on a pirate ship. Honestly, this film's bad. It's not the worst, which is something, but I still didn't like the film. I kind of did enjoy making fun of it and laughing at the crazy hijinks, but that's about it. In fairness, Moore felt more comfortable in the role, and I liked him quite a bit as Bond. And legendary film actor Christopher Lee is the villain. He played roles like Solomon in The Lord of the Rings, Count Dooku in Star Wars, and Dracula in like 10 films. Turns out he is Ian Fleming, the creator of Bond's cousin, which is fascinating, but he's good as always. Knick-Knack is an okay henchman, but is often played for laughs, though that's not surprising given the film's slapstick nature, and Christopher Lee's island, complete with a weird funhouse kill arena, is kind of neat, and it ties into the character's circus backstory. Goodnight, is the Bond girl in this film, is as generic as her name. She's just a dumb woman who follows the plot and does little else. She also gets locked in a closet and watches Bond have sex at one point, which is pretty weird. Otherwise, she's just forgettable. Some more weird stuff is the karate in this movie. They definitely wanted a taste of the booming kung fu genre at the time, popularized by Bruce Lee, as if the blaxploitation stuff from the last film wasn't enough for Bond.
125th, you got a honky on your tail.
But I guess the fear was Bond was falling out of relevance, so I kind of get it, but it still kind of feels eye-rolly and dated now. The annoying sheriff guy from the last film joins Bond again in a car chase and has his normal Louisiana antics.
How about demonstration, boy? Certainly, sir.
Kind of confused why he was shopping for cars in China, being from the American South though. That seems kind of expensive to ship back. It seems more efficient for him to just buy the car in America, but whatever. They also do this Dukes of Hazzard car flip, complete with slide whistle, which while cool is kind of out of place, especially with the comic antics happening at the same time. Finally, the theme and title graphics are okay, but a bit paint by numbers with an air of cheese, which I think kind of sums up this film pretty well. Lewis Gilbert returns after a long absence to direct The Spy Who Loved Me, which is probably the most polarized I've felt about a Bond film yet. The first half of this film was a slog where I was pretty bored and honestly not feeling Roger Moore in the role. Then the second half, I completely bought Moore in the role and had a lot of fun with the film. It's really odd when the first half of the film is low tier, while the back half is high tier in my opinion. Ultimately, it ranks in the middle of my Bond ranking, which you can find on my Letterboxd in the description. Anyways, the plot of this film, as always, follows Bond, who teams up with the Russian agent Anya after they compete in trying to find a microfilm that holds a clue to find some submarines that went missing. They initially don't find anything on the film, but soon notice that the film came from Carl Stromberg, so they go to investigate Stromberg and eventually find out he has a plan to destroy the world by starting nuclear war between the superpowers. This eventually leads to Anya getting captured and a big fight between Bond and his American submarine crew and Stromberg's goons breaking out. Ultimately, Bond gets the stolen subs to blow each other up, and he kills Stromberg. The film ends as always with Bond having sex with the film's Bond girl. Here are some of the things I liked about this film. Anya's a great Bond girl and feels like Bond's equal, starting from her first screen appearance where it looks like she's a witless woman having sex with the secret agent, but it turns out she's the secret agent having sex with a witless man. This also mirrors how we first met Bond in the film, implying that they're equals from the get-go. She's helpful to Bond throughout the movie, and besides a few moments, mostly feels like Bond's equal. That is, until the last 30 minutes where she's captured and becomes your run-of-the-mill damsel in distress we've pretty much come to expect from this franchise. All in all, though, she has to be a top-tier Bond girl thus far, and is my favorite in the series up to this point. I like that they mentioned Tracy from On Her Majesty's Secret Service and how Bond is sensitive about her death, especially since these films more or less brush off her existence up until this point.
Many lady friends, but married only once. Wife killed.
All right, you've made your point.
And while I consider each Bond to live in their own bubble, as it were, I still consider them to have the same general backstory. And I like that this Bond film mentions one of the most major events in Bond's life that was more or less ignored post-Lazenby up to this point. There are a lot of cool action moments in this film. The whole sub-fight is fantastic, from the nukes to the fighting, down to even Bond's little bomb planting moment. It's a lot of fun. The one real beat from this movie I remember from childhood is the underwater Lotus as Spirit, which is still a great moment and one of the most fun Bond gadgets. I like it quite a bit. The ski jump before the credits was cool, though I think the Union flag is a bit cheesy and on the nose. And the Jaws jump scare was actually pretty surprising and got me despite knowing when Bond is on a train, trouble tends to emerge. It gave me a jolt though. Speaking of Jaws though, this might be a hot take, but I'm not in love with the character. He has cool moments, don't get me wrong, but even as a kid I wasn't a huge fan. He's threatening, but doesn't have much depth. Stromberg feels like a discount Blofeld to me. His plan seems like some kooky shit Blofeld would come up with in a parody film, and he doesn't really feel that threatening. The opening song, performed by Carl Simon, is pretty good, if a little bit cheesy. I do remember having this song stuck in my head as a kid, and it's up there with the Goldfinger song as one of the most earwormy songs in the franchise. You know, despite not being that good. The opening cinematic is cool as always, but not my favorite by any means. All in all, I'm pretty split on this film. I don't hate it, I don't love it. It has its moments that I love and its moments that I hate, which makes it feel pretty weird to me overall. But ultimately, it's okay. Moonraker is one of the Bond films I'd never seen before constructing this video, but perhaps is the one I was most morbidly curious about. After the success of Star Wars, this film was essentially made to capitalize off that success, becoming more grand than the novel itself to achieve this. Moore's run on Bond is fascinating because of just how much the producers of this franchise just threw shit at the wall in the quest for money, which I think was a detriment in Live and Let Die with the blaxploitation vibes and Man with the Golden Gun and its kung fu vibes. How does Bond fare in a sci-fi situation though? Well, I liked it. I didn't love it, and I don't quite like it as much as Moore's last entry, but it is where I think Moore really started to fit into the role. While the early Moore films, especially Live and Let Die, had camp, they also felt a bit like Connery's later entries with a new face. This film would not work with Connery, and frankly, probably none of the other Bonds could have pulled this off either. This film feels a bit derivative of The Spy Who Loved Me with a bit of Thunderball thrown in. Basically, Bond is blamed for a stolen Moonraker aircraft after a dramatic fight with Jaws. This leads him to meet our new villain Drax, who runs the Moonraker program and is essentially Elon Musk, the Bond villain. Anyways, he teams up with American spy Holly Goodhead to get to the bottom of Drax's plan, all while being tracked by Jaws through numerous locations like California, Venice, and Brazil. Eventually culminating with Bond and Holly stealing a Moonraker ship and going to Drax's satellite city he is constructing with the hopes of sending a probe to blow up parts of the Earth, essentially taking the world hostage from his satellite. But Bond gets Jaws on his side after saying that Jaws' girlfriend won't live up to Drax's standard of perfection, so Jaws teams up with Bond and Holly to take over the spacecraft, and a group of Marines arrive at the spaceship to get in a laser shootout in space. Anyways, they all escape the now ravaged satellite. Bond manages to blow up the probe headed towards Earth, and he makes space sex with Holly. As I said, this film lifts a lot from the plot of The Spy Who Loved Me, with Holly being essentially Anya from that film. And the endgame is basically Drax living in space instead of Stromberg, who lived underwater. And even the fight in space isn't too dissimilar to the underwater fights from Thunderball. and as a result, Holly and Drax feel pretty interchangeable with previous Bond characters, but they're ultimately good for what they are. The film does have a lot of good set pieces too, with the skydiving fight against Jaws, the gondola fight against Jaws, the Venice boat chase, and even the space stuff, even though the lasers are a bit much for a Bond film in my opinion. One thing I will give this over The Spy Who Loves Me is the story feels a lot less bogged down. The plot in that movie was pretty disinteresting for the first hour, and while this plot isn't too far off, they had a lot of fun stuff to keep the film going throughout the whole runtime. And even the crazy stuff I think works for a lot more than say Connery or Craig's Bond, where it wouldn't have worked at all. And as a result of the craziness, this may be my favorite performance by Moore, as he just seems to be having a blast filming this one. And for the time, the space stuff looks pretty good. I don't think it was on the level of Star Wars when it comes to the lasers and stuff, but I really enjoy the costumes and the models they used to make the satellite come to life, as well as the shuttles. The Shirley Bassey intro song is quite good, as are all her Bond songs, and the intro graphics are great as always, though far from my favorite in the series. Finally, this would be Bernard Lee's last run as M. Sadly, he passed away after this film was released, and even in the film, he certainly looks worse for the wear, but I have to say his role as M is what made the character stick so well, and I think he did a fantastic job throughout his entire run. All in all, Moonraker was a fun camp fest, and I can see how it's a love it or hate it type of Bond film, but if you like some camp, I say give it a watch, as I may even consider it a tad underrated. For Your Eyes Only is a fairly good Bond film that strips away a lot of the glamour and high stakes of the previous two entries in favor of a much more grounded story. Basically, the plot goes as follows. Bond is sent on a mission to retrieve a missing piece of equipment called the ATAC that both the English and the Russians are after. After it's sunk to the bottom of the ocean, nearby to this, our Bond girl for the film, Melina's parents are murdered soon after the three are united. Anyways, Bond is told to track down Hector Gonzalez, who murdered Melina's parents, and question him as to the whereabouts of the ATAC. This is where he first crosses paths with Melina. Anyways, Gonzalez is killed by Melina, and the pair escape. Bond learns of her mission of revenge, and tells her to not go through with it.
Before setting out on revenge, you first dig 2 graves.
Which is ironic, seeing as he just killed Blofeld for revenge just a couple scenes earlier. Mr. Bond! Anyways, Bond travels to Cortina and meets with a man named Luigi, who's in the Italian Secret Service, and introduces him to Cristados, who dumps exposition on Bond about the White Dove crime family, and its leader Columbo. So Bond spies on Columbo to get intel and meets a woman, Lysel von Schlaff, who Columbo is having an affair with, and Bond sleeps with her to try to gather intel because James Bond likes to have sex all the time. Anyways, they take a stroll on the beach the next morning and they're attacked by some White Dove members. Issel is killed, but then they're saved by other White Dove members who work for Columbo, and Columbo reveals that Cristados is actually the villain. So they raid Cristados' base, and after this scuffle, Bond runs into Helena and asks what her parents were up to before his death, and it turns out her father was diving into the wreckage of the ship that blew up at the start to try to find the ATAC, so they go underwater to get it, and they're attacked, but they get out of there, only to be captured by Cristados, who then ties them up and tows them around in an attempt to kill them, I guess, but they break free. They then meet up with Columbo, who's like, I know where Cristados is hiding, at this monastery in the mountain. And Bond's like, alright, so Bond climbs the cliff while the others take the main path, and they sneak around doing spy stuff. They then defeat Cristados, and Helena's like, yeah, I'm gonna kill this guy, but then Bond's like, no, don't do it because revenge gets you nowhere.
Out of my way, James.
Alright. But be prepared to dig those 2 graves.
Even though he just murdered Blofeld at the start of the movie. But then Cristado pulls out a knife in an attempt to kill Bond, and Columbo yoinks him with his own throwing knife. Then Bond and Helena make love, because that's how these films always end. So yeah, this film's pretty good, but it's also kind of confusing, and is a lot to take in, because there's a lot of plot jammed into this film's just over 2-hour runtime. It has some mixed messaging here, because like I said, Bond is telling Helena throughout the runtime that she shouldn't get revenge, because revenge is bad, but the film opens up with him at Tracy's grave, and then this is immediately followed by him killing Blofeld, which isn't even relevant to the actual plot of the the film. The reason they pretty unceremoniously killed Blofeld was because MGM no longer owns the rights to the character due to a lawsuit with Kevin McClory, who helped Ian Fleming write the original Thunderball novel, the novel where Blofeld debuted. So I get why they would kill him, but it spits in the face of the rest of the film, which Bond constantly makes it known that revenge is bad. If this was in another film, I wouldn't have minded it so much. The other strange contradiction is with Bond and the secondary Bond girl Bibi, who Bond won't have sex with due to her age, which is fair. Moore is 54 during this film, but then he has sex with Melina, whom he is 30 years older than, and is like the same age as Bibi. I don't really care about age gaps, but let's be honest, Bond's rules are confusing in this film. On that note, Melina is a decent Bond girl, but her and Moore don't really share that much romantic chemistry till the end. Most of the time they just feel like colleagues in this film, but the last 5 minutes Bond has to have sex with someone, so that's what happens. I like Christados as a villain as well, but he's far from the strongest in the series. What makes me ultimately rank this fairly high is the darker tone, which is kind of a fun change of pace. It feels a lot more like an 80s action B-movie film, which I enjoyed a lot admittedly. This is also John Glenn's first go at the franchise. His style is quite different from Terrence's younger Guy Hamilton, who directed most of the previous official films. But the stripped-back action and adventure is a nice change of pace for the franchise. Moore is good in this film, but certainly feels a bit more at home in the cheesier films from the 70s, but he still gets it done and does a good job. And the rock climbing scene had me on the edge of my seat, probably more than anything else in the franchise so far. The opening song was a bit weak, so were the cinematics, and the film had too much exposition for its own good. But overall, it was a pretty good experience, with Roger Moore, while not giving his best performance, manning the ship pretty well on this one, and it had a nice 80s action film charm, which I really enjoyed. So overall, pretty good. For me, Roger Moore always had a lot of potential as Bond, but unfortunately I didn't care for many of his films, and For Your Eyes Only, which I actually liked, didn't feel very Moore-ish, and that story was more fitting for another actor like Connery. However, for me, Octopussy changed that, and in my opinion brought out the best balance of the more fun Bond Roger Moore is known for, but also balancing this with a story with high stakes and less cheesy subject matter to kind of round it out to be both easy to get invested in, but is also more fitting for Moore. And at least for me, that's a really hard balance to strike with the Moore films. But this film is evidence that if you get it to work, it works brilliantly, with this ranking pretty high in my Bond rank up till this point. The plot of this film feels less convoluted than the last one. Basically, after the death of 009, British intelligence wants to find out the meaning of a counterfeit Farberg egg. Meanwhile, we learn of a Soviet General Orlov who wants to take over Europe, but we'll come back to this later. Anyways, this leads to Bond investigating the real egg, which leads him to a man named Kamal Khan. He follows Kamal to India, where he's finally introduced to him and reveals that he has the real egg, and the one Kamal has is fake. This leads to Bond's capture and the theft of the egg, but not before Bond gets a tracker in it. As it turns out, Kamal is working for a jewelry smuggler, the titular Octopussy, and after escaping Kamal's compound, introduces himself to her. This leads to an affair between the two, but this is interrupted when a group of hitmen hired by Kamal try to murder Bond. Anyways, Bond escapes, and Kamal and Octopussy meet up and start the smuggling operation of her jewels. But unbeknownst to Octopussy, Kamal and the general from earlier are also planting a nuke on the train to blow up a US base in West Berlin in hopes that Europe denuclearizes so that Russia can obtain dominance over the rest of Europe. After a scuffle on the train, during which the general is killed, Bond manages to make it back to the US base and disarm the bomb right before it exploded. Realizing she was betrayed, Octopussy teams up with Bond and heads back to Kamal's compound, where Octopussy ends up captured and leaving on a plane with Kamal. But Bond manages to save her and kill Kamal by sending the airplane off a cliff. And as always, Bond bangs Octopussy at the end. I like how the plot of this film wasn't very nuclear focused until the end. With a fairly big handful of the principal characters, the plot could have been bogged down by the weight of the plot. However, this movie opts to give Moore a lot of time to play around and discover the underlying mystery, which I enjoy. Octopussy is a fantastic Bond girl and feels pretty age appropriate for Moore. Again, I don't mind age gaps, but with an older Bond, I feel like he should be dating more established women, because I find it a bit weird to watch a 55-year-old man making out with girls that are my age. The villain is great too, with Orlov, a great secondary villain, and Kamal being a great main antagonist. Probably one of my favorite villains to date in a Bond film, honestly. M was finally replaced in this film after his absence in From Your Eyes Only by Robert Brown, and he does a good job in the part. There is a headcanon that says that he is a different M, as Brown also played Admiral Hargraves, a bit part in The Spy Who Loved Me. Who knows what the filmmakers intended, but however you want to look at it, he still does a good job, though Bernard Lee is still a legend in the part. I really like the balance this film strikes, as it's not too silly like Moonraker, but it takes itself more seriously than most of its earlier entries, which I find is a great balance for Roger Moore. Honestly, I think the tone is sort of similar to that of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which makes sense since that film was a hit a mere 2 years before this film came out. The plot is taken seriously by the characters, but they're all still able to have a lot of fun with the material, which is just the right sweet spot for the Moore Bonds. There were also a ton of really fun sequences, like after Bond's escape from Kamal, he has a Most Dangerous Game-esque escape sequence. Bond's fight on the train and how he gets to the train using the cars on the train tracks was cool. The guy with the buzzsaw whip, who seemed straight out of Mortal Kombat at the end of the fight with the ladies in Kamal's compound, was a pretty cool character, even though he only showed up like once. And the plane scene at the end gave me straight up North by Northwest vibes. This film has some top tier actions, and while silly, it never feels so silly that it takes me out of the film. The opening song is fine, and the cinematics are pretty weak for it. Overall, though, this is a fantastic Moore Bond film, finally, and makes me very excited to watch Moore's last output as Bond. Before we can get to that, though, we have a brief pit stop outside of our traditional Bond series, with Sean Connery's last effort as Bond. Coming out a mere 4 months and a day after Octopussy comes Sean Connery's last live-action Bond performance in Never Say Never Again. This film is a remake of Thunderball due to legal disputes that I alluded to earlier. So basically, Kevin McCloy worked with Ian Fleming to create a treatment for Thunderball before Eon started making their own Bond films, and the treatment wasn't picked up. However, Ian, not wanting the script to go to waste, adapted the project into a book. However, after a legal battle, Kevin got the rights to partial ownership of the Thunderball book, allowing him to make this film based on the concept. This led eventually to him working on this film with Warner Brothers. The project took a long time to make as they had to tread very carefully on what was produced, so not to bump into copyrights with Eon. Eventually, Sean Connery signed onto the film, and as the film approached, the media dubbed this film and Octopussy's close release dates as the Battle of the Bonds, with the two most tenured Bonds to this point, Connery and Moore, going head-to-head with the rival studios at the helm. It's also worth noting this film was directed by Irving Kershner, fresh off the mega hit The Empire Strikes Back. Interestingly, McClory was planning a second Thunderball remake with Sony, which was going to come out around the year 2000, with talks of having another former Bond, Timothy Dalton, or possibly Liam Neeson, taking the role. However, this film would not make it through the courts, making this the final Bond film to be released unofficially. Anyhow, how does this stack up when compared to the official Eon releases? Well, honestly, I think it's pretty damn good. And in my eyes, this is a pretty good remake of the Thunderball story that does enough different from the original film to feel fresh, and honestly, I like this take quite a bit more than Eon's. In a lot of ways, this does for Connery's version of Bond what Logan did for Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. The basic plot of Thunderball is still here. Largo manages to steal a couple nukes, which Bond has to reclaim. Domino is still here, being the lover of Largo, but eventually realizing he killed her brother and joining Bond to stop him. However, this version sees an older Bond in an underfunded MI6, essentially being on the bench, as M rarely uses the 00 program anymore. M complains that he's out of shape and needs to get back in the game. Then, with the threat of stolen nukes, Bond is forced to get back into the action and be a spy once again. Honestly, I really like this concept, and if you ignore Thunderball, you could almost consider this a bookend to Sean's career as Bond, with him getting into a seemingly legitimate relationship with Domino at the end. At least that's what they implied.
Only to plead for your return, sir. M says that without you in the service, he fears for the security of the civilized world.
Never again.
It's a nice interpretation of the story with great stakes, and it's nice to see Connery's version of Bond kind of get his own conclusion. I like how this Bond feels very much like the Bond from those early Eon films, but not entirely the same, as the years have made him a little more cynical, which is a natural progression for how Sean played Bond in his early adventures, I think, with him always having that cynical edge. He also seems to have more fun with the role than he did at the end of his career with Eon, putting in one of my favorite performances of him as Bond. The action is in vein of Eon, but does its own thing, with notable examples being the fight early in the film against the strongman at the physical therapy place, ending with a urine fatality. The motorcycle fight scene, ending in the obliteration of henchwoman Fatima Blush, and the final underwater fight for the second nuclear bomb. The supporting cast is all distinct from the main series counterparts, but still do great in their role. M, as portrayed by Edward Fox, seems to take his job a little more seriously, with little patience for Bond's antics and paying little mind to the 00 division he sees as dated. By contrast, Q is also played very differently, being more chummy with Bond and a bit of a grumpy asshole about the state of MI6, which I find different and kind of fun. Finally, Kim Basinger, who you may know from the Batman series as Vicky Vale, is also spectacular in her role, having more importance than many of the early Bond girls from the series. I even think I like Klaus Burr's take on Largo more than Adolph Seeley's, with this man being absolutely insane, just doing crazy charismatic stuff, and it's great. This film also took the opportunity to bookend Connery's take, which I really enjoy, since at this time Eon's Bond were all one character. You couldn't really slow down Bond, so even though Roger Moore is 3 years older than Connery, even he had to seem in perfect shape in Octopussy as portraying someone in their prime, which they don't really do with this movie, and it gave Bond's character some actual growth. Not that I mind what Eon does, as I'm a fan of these early films too, but it's nice that this film allowed us to see Bond in a different perspective. I also have to point out that Bond participated in the first Major League Gaming event against Largo, ultimately winning a $267,000 prize, which he traded for a dance with Domino. This was used to tell her about her dead brother, by the way, and this was a replacement for the original scene, which took place on the beach. Finally, this film doesn't have a lot of Eon tropes you'd expect, which is fine with me, honestly. We don't really have a flashy intro, rather it's just B-roll with a very Bondish theme song, Never Say Never Again, performed by Lonnie Hall, and it's a decent enough Bond song. However, this also means no gun barrel sequence nor iconic Bond score. Though watching this, I didn't really mind that much, since I don't really need those superficial Bond trademarks to get me through the movie, though they are charming and nice to have in the Eon Bond films. All in all, it's a fun swan song to Sean Connery's Bond, and unique enough from the Eon version of Thunderball to stand out on its own just fine. I really enjoyed it. Alright, speaking of swan songs, A View to a Kill is Roger Moore's final turn as Bond, being his 7th installment, which ties him with Connery for the most films playing the Bond character, if you count Never Say Never Again to Connery's total. Along with Roger Moore, this would also mark the last time Lois Maxwell plays Moneypenny, who held the role from Dr. No until this film, ending up playing the part for a total of 14 entries. Some people consider this the end of the Bond continuity established by Dr. No, though as I said, I consider the Bond series to be continuity light. A View to a Kill is the most average Bond film in the catalog to me, up until this point. I certainly didn't have many issues with the film, and there were a good handful of things I really liked, but when it's all put together, it is just as I've implied, pretty average. Okay, so here's the plot. James Bond finds a microchip on a dead agent, 003, and the parent company to the people who created this chip was Zorin Industries. This chip is supposed to be unaffected by magnetic pulses, meaning that in the event of a nuclear attack, the British would still have electronics. However, this chip had Soviet origins, so Bond, Q, Moneypenny, and M go to spy on Max Zorin, the owner of the company, in hopes of finding evidence of what he's doing, which takes them to a horse race. Max's horse wins, which seems unlikely as the horse was not a purebred horse with impressive ancestors, which leads Bond to want to figure out why this is. And in a stroke of luck, as it turns out, Max is having a horse sale at his estate, which Bond uses as an excuse to snoop around with his cohort, Godfrey Tibbett, who's a horse trainer. Anyhow, Bond finds the underground manufacturing plant where Max is hoarding microchips, and Max is onto him, leading to Godfrey's death. Anyways, Bond is captured after a horse race, and they try to drown him, but he escapes. After this, we learn of Zorn's plan, which is to basically cause a series of explosions in a mine paired with flooding, which will destroy Silicon Valley and give a monopoly on the microchip market. This is remarkably similar to Goldfinger's plan in, well, Goldfinger, even homaging the part where the associates won out, with Goldfinger killing him. Anyways, Bond meets back up with this film's Bond girl Stacy, who he briefly met at Zorn's party, where she explains that she's the daughter of a rival oil baron to Zorin, and basically got strong-armed out of the business, with Zorin offering her $5 million hush money. So she teams up with Bond, leading them to the mine where this is all going down. Zorin kills a lot of his workers, leading the main henchman Mayday to defect from the operation and blowing herself up to clear the bomb from the rest of the explosives that would have brought Zorin's plan into fruition. Zorin captures Stacy and tries to escape. After a scuffle on top of the Golden Gate Bridge, though, Bond kills Zorin and his men and blows up the blimp. So as I said, this film is something of a soft remake of Goldfinger. The general plot is basically the same, with elements changed here and there, but Bond even spends a significant amount of time snooping around Zorin's estate, not unlike what he does in Goldfinger. The boardroom scene is basically a remake of the one from Goldfinger, but much like Never Say Never Again and Thunderball, they're different enough to where the changes still make it stand alone pretty well. For one, this film has a lot of amazing set pieces, like the chase on the Eiffel Tower, which looks marvelous for the time. I've read it's the same set they used in Superman 2, which makes perfect sense, and it's actually a super nice set in both films. Of course, the Golden Gate Bridge was a pretty cool effect as well. The office that got set on fire only to have a really neat elevator shaft sequence was pretty cool, and of course it was pretty awesome when Walken goes crazy and shoots up his crew with an Uzi. Speaking of Christopher Walken, he was fantastic in this film and may have been my favorite Bond villain just because of his performance. He's crazy when he needs to be, but also sort of pulls off being a stuck-up rich guy as well. I mean, on top of the Uzi scene, he starts a fire at City Hall, he even tries to kill Bond with an axe. I really dug him in this role, and I really like his strong screen presence. Same with his henchman Mayday, who is threatening and crazy, just like Walken, ultimately blowing herself up just to spite him for betraying her. Our Bond girl Stacy, played by Tanya Roberts, is a little less impressive to me. She kind of comes along for the ride and is just there to be a love interest. Unfortunately, that kind of holds back the great acting of Roger Moore, who's on top form for his last outing. And honestly, the more spread out action gives Moore a lot of time to build on the material presented. I still think he's a hair better in Octopussy, but the bottom half of his tenure as Bond was really strong. If I had to point out my most major complaint, it's when Bond is snowboarding at the start and starts playing a 60s beach rock song. Anyways, with that said, the opening cinematic was fantastic, which is something the last few films have been lacking on. The song was also decent, but it's about the most 80s thing I've ever heard, which, what can you really expect when the song's scored by Duran Duran? To conclude Roger Moore's run on Bond, it was overall pretty fun. I think the start of his run was lacking a bit, but that isn't really to fault Moore, and by the end of his run, he proved to be iconic in the role with a fully unique angle to it, which I think could have only existed in this time in cinema. With that said, let's go on to the fairly short tenure of Timothy Dalton. The Living Daylight introduces us to the fourth main series Bond in Timothy Dalton, whose run only tops George Lazenby's single-entry in length run, being a mere 2 films total. The Living Daylights maintains John Glenn as director, and Timothy Dalton was somewhat on the back burner to play Bond, as he was the frontrunner when Roger Moore considered leaving before For Your Eyes Only, with Moore ultimately deciding to do that film and the following 2 Bond films before finally retiring from the role. And when it came to film this movie, Pierce Brosnan, the next Bond, was signed to the role, but he had to leave due to scheduling conflicts with the TV contract he had at the time. Ultimately, though, the role of Bond would end up with Dalton, who finally and narrowly had his chance at the role. With that said, let's discuss The Living Daylights. And look, I may be breaking the rules of the James Bond fandom by saying this, but I think this is my favorite one yet. Anyway, let's touch on the plot real quick. The Living Daylights is a Bond film that leans on Bond's espionage side, and is a vast departure from the more humorous Moore era. Okay, so the plot centers around Bond, who after the death of a couple of 00 agents is sent on a mission to rescue General Koskov, who plans to defect and help get to the bottom of the mystery at hand. On this mission, Bond notices a girl named Cara Milvoy, who is a concert cellist. Anyhow, Bond's trying to cover up Koskov's escape when he sees a rival assassin who ends up being Kara. Bond shoots the gun out of her hand and evacuates Koskov to Austria. But the rescue is short-lived, as right under MI6's nose, Koskov is kidnapped by Necros, our main henchman for this movie, who's disguised as a milkman. Anyways, Bond heads back to Czechoslovakia, where he first meets, in person, Kara, who it turns out isn't actually trying to kill Koskov because they're lovers, and now she's being trailed by the KGB. Her and Bond manage to escape Czechoslovakia after a chase back to Austria, where they end up at an opera and find out about an arms dealer named Brad Whitaker, a disgraced soldier who's supplying the KGB with arms in their fight against Afghanistan. Anyhow, it turns out that it was Whitaker that killed the 00 agents, and Bond hatches a plan to fake General Pruskin's death, who initially was blamed so that Whitaker continues his plan, thinking correctly that Whitaker wants Pushkin out of the way so that he can keep the money that the Russians gave him and keep in their good graces. Anyhow, it also turns out that Koskov is working with Whitaker to basically get rich and convinces Kara to help capture Bond, which they do, but Kara quickly realizes she should have trusted Bond and is betrayed by Koskov, who leaves them in Afghanistan. After escaping and saving an Afghani prisoner, who turns out to be the leader of the rebellion against the Russians, they rush to an airstrip where Whitaker is trying to smuggle $500 million in heroin. Bond hijacks the plane, nearly saving Kara, but Necros manages to get on board, and after a fight he falls to his death, but Whitaker and Koskov get away. Bond ends up raiding Whitaker's home with the help of the KGB, and after a fight kills Whitaker, with Kostov being arrested by the KGB. Kara is granted a travel visa and becomes a major concert cellist, and of course the film ends with Bond banging her, because this isn't a Bond film if it doesn't end with Bond banging a chick. As you may be able to tell by my confusing summary, this film has a lot of twists and turns and characters to keep up with, but if you watch it twice or pay good attention, it isn't too hard to get the gist of. And honestly, the plot pays off in major ways throughout, and it's just immensely intriguing to watch the story unfold. Kara is probably my favorite Bond girl so far. Her actress, Miriam, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that last name, has a fantastic rapport with Dalton, and I actually buy their relationship being more than just a couple of people who bang because they're both in a James Bond movie. It builds up the trust, the twists, and even Bond's intuition about her. And while the little scene they have at the fair has some exposition in it, it's also used to set up their relationship, and it actually feels pretty real. In a lot of these films, you kind of have to settle for good chemistry with often lacking setup, but this film does great with setting up the relationship plus great chemistry. And she even gets a cool ending with her becoming a major cellist and star act in an orchestra, which is far more of a resolution than most Bond girls, whose payoff often ends up just being the fact that they have sex with Bond. Kinda makes me sad that due to the nature of these films, we wouldn't see her again past this film. The new Moneypenny, played by Caroline Bliss, is also a lot of fun. Casting a younger Moneypenny allows for the flirtier side of her and Bond's relationship to come out that we saw from the early Connery films. And her and Dalton also have great chemistry, which I think is a testament to all the actors in this film being fantastic, which I think is a great segue into talking about Dalton as Bond. From his first appearance, I bought him as Bond, but I could also feel how this version of the character was vastly different from more Connery and Lazenby's versions before. He's grittier, less in it for the fun, but also does a great job of being suave and having romantic Bond moments when needed. The three villains of this are a little less developed than most, but I think this is in favor of having a more complex plot than most of the Bonds, with a fairly unclear villain until the final 45 minutes. This film also holds probably my favorite fights in the whole series so far. I mean, the opening scene was fantastic, starting with the training to the death of 004, then Dalton's reveal onto Bond hanging from a car, to an amazing mid-air car explosion, and the scene being bookended by a romance scene between Bond and the bored woman on a boat. Not long after that, we have the kitchen fight with Necros, which was amazingly choreographed with awesome set design as well as really hard-hitting sound effects. Then the scene where Bond escapes to Austria with Kara, starting with a car chase leading to them driving across a frozen lake, then to have their tires shot out as they jump a ramp only to escape by riding Kara's cello case down a hill. The final confrontation with Whitaker, where he's using a crazy prototype weapon in his booby-trapped room, while Bond has only a pistol and kills him with a statue of Julius Caesar, which is poetic for the warmonger. As well, we kind of see this character comparing himself to the likes of Hitler, Caesar, Napoleon, and Genghis Khan with his little collection of mannequins earlier. Finally, the best action scene, which involves a shootout at the Russian airstrip, Bond hijacks a cargo plane holding heroin. Kara drives a jeep into the plane, but Necros manages to get on board while Bond is defusing a bomb he planted on the plane. Bond and Necros fight, leading to them hanging out of the back of the plane, to which Necros eventually gets knocked off by Bond. Bond then defuses the bomb, gets back to the cockpit right before the plane crashes, and steers clear of an oncoming mountain range, only for Bond to realize the fuel tank was hit and the plane is going to go down, so they hover over a highway and they use a parachute on the back of a jeep to jump out the back, and Kara and Bond get off board before the whole thing blows up. I have to applaud director John Glenn for essentially rebooting the franchise midway through his run on Bond and doing a large tonal shift to boot. The opening cinematic is cool and the song performed by Aha is great, though it's worth noting it almost feels as 80s as the Duran Duran score from A View to the Kill. Overall, I really love this film. It's genuinely sad. Such a great piece of filmmaking is kind of covered up by the fact that it's a franchise film, and one made deep into the Bond franchise at that. Sadly, that seems to happen with a lot of great Bond entries, especially the older ones, as many people may dismiss the films as not their thing based on the preconceived notion of the rest of the films. I can easily see die-hard Bond fans not feeling this one as much as a lot of the others, because it's quite different from the Connery or Moore eras, and on top of that, it drops a lot of Bond tropes from later and previous entries. But for someone who's a more casual fan, or someone who has seen very few or no Bond films, check it out, especially if you're an Indiana Jones fan, as tonally, John Glenn seems to emulate those films quite well. License to Kill is Dalton's last turn as Bond, as well as John Glenn's last film in the director's chair. Dalton was going to be in a third film, rumored to be titled Property of a Lady, one of the only Bond titles that he and Fleming used in a book that wasn't taken for a film, but he dropped out in 1994 after a copyright dispute was taking a long time. Thus, we got Pierce Brosnan as James Bond in Goldeneye 6 years after this film's release. The film itself was pretty good, landing on my top 10, but honestly not cracking the upper echelons for me. Anyhow, Bond is out for revenge in this film, with the movie starting off with the capture of Franz Sanchez, our main bad guy, and cartel leader in this film, with the help of Felix. This is all on his wedding day, with Felix marrying Della Churchill. However, things quickly go awry as Sanchez is freed and gets revenge on Felix by killing Della and maiming Felix with a shark. This leads to Bond teaming up with Sharky, a close friend of Felix's, who is also killed. Bond goes rogue and begins to try to interrupt Sanchez's operation, wanting him dead. Bond leaves behind M and the rest of his 00 team, eventually meeting up with our main Bond girl, Pam Boisvert, a pilot who was working for Felix on the operation. After a scuffle with a young Benicio del Toro playing Dario, the pair escaped to Mexico with some cash Bond stole shortly after Sharky died. This allows the pair to access Sanchez's casino, in which they used to gain his trust. Bond tries to assassinate Sanchez, but fails, ultimately being captured by a group of Hong Kong drug enforcement officers. But Sanchez finds the place they took him to and blows it up, leading to Bond's rescue and Sanchez assuming he's a rogue agent who's truly on his side. Bond uses this to get one of his top lieutenants killed, Milton Crest. Eventually, this all culminates in Bond touring Sanchez's drug compound with some Hong Kong investors that Sanchez brought in, and Dario recognizes him, leading Bond to set the place on fire, and Sanchez trying to kill Bond with a hydraulic grinder. However, after Pam comes in, Dario is killed in the grinder, leading the pair to chase down Sanchez, ultimately blowing him to fucking pieces. Bond is kissed by a less than relevant sub-Bond girl, Lupe Lamora, who is dating Sanchez, but he ultimately decides to end up with Pam instead. So yeah, I feel like this whole plot really wanted to do different things, but ultimately fell right back into the Bond formula. The villain is dealing in street drugs with his hands in the pockets of corrupt politicians. He is based on real men that exist, and he's brutal, killing whoever with little mercy, seeking revenge and just being generally evil. But in the end, it kind of still resorts to just a fight and an evil layer, and Bond must chase the villain. I did like a lot of the side characters in this one, with Del Toro being a real standout, being crazy and unhinged, or Milton Crest being more business than brawn, and it's nice seeing these personalities. I kind of like the two Bond girls with Pam and Lupe, but they seem to follow the standard outline of Bond girls, essentially being one-note characters. Lupe, who's the villain's girlfriend, and then there's the tough but shallow Pam. They just aren't well fleshed out like Kara in the last film, and after liking her and actually giving her an arc, going back to the standard Bond girl formula felt a little dry. That isn't to actually take credit away from these two girls. Normally I'd say they're quite good for a Bond film, but after all the great writing that went into Kara, it was just a tough act to follow. Felix is a mixed bag for me as well. I would have loved it if he was more involved after his injury and death of his wife, but Bond goes on his revenge quest and Felix kinda just disappears, which sucks because the first 30 minutes of this film set him up to be by far the best Bond-Felix relationship in the series yet, and even at the end, it was a bit of a clunky end for Felix, with him happily shooting the shit with Bond. Perhaps we could have had a scene of him reeling over the death of his wife, and Bond comforting him, having been in the exact same situation and on Her Majesty's Secret Service with the death of Tracy. In fact, right before Felix and Della are attacked, Felix remarks that Bond had a wife a long time ago, foreshadowing the tragic events that are about to happen pretty brilliantly.
Is there something wrong? He was married once, but it was a long time ago.
So why that wasn't paid off, especially when John Glenn's attention to detail in the last film, is beyond me. Bond's other core cast, M and Moneypenny, don't even really get to interact with Bond, which sucks. Although there's a pretty good scene when Bond goes rogue and M disagrees with this, with M's men opening fire on Bond and M essentially bullshitting a reason to spare him, being that there are too many witnesses when clearly it was the affection for Bond causing M to spare him. This would be Robert Brown's last turn as M as well. Overall, he had a good, if short, tenure. Anyhow, while Moneypenny and M are underutilized, Q is the exception, with him also going rogue to help Bond in the field a bit and giving him some gadgets, and it's nice seeing Desmond Llewellyn getting to expand his role after all these films. This film's probably the darkest Bond yet, with Dario, Crest, and Sanchez's violent deaths, as well as the fairly graphic kidnapping of Della and Felix, with Felix even losing his leg as well. Bond brutally feeding Ed Kilfer, the DEA agent who betrayed Felix, to a shark after he offered Bond $1 million bribe. Bond seems more serious in this film, though it makes sense with the context of the film and is consistent with how Dalton played him in the previous film. Again, Dalton does a fantastic job with the role of Bond. The opening song by Gladys Knight is great, as per usual. The opening cinematic is good as well. Overall, this film is darker and more serious. It just kind of falls into the Bond formula, and a more censored version of the script could have easily played in the Connery or Moore eras. However, it's still very well filmed, but it is a shame that the side characters are either undercooked or kind of fall flat by the end. And that is the end of the short but overall very strong Timothy Dalton era, and I overall very much enjoyed it, even with some of the flaws in the second film in the series. Goldeneye is Pierce Brosnan's first film as Bond, after Bond 17 was so long delayed that Timothy Dalton backed out, as well as the first film directed by Martin Campbell, who rebooted Bond for the 90s audience and then would reboot Bond again 11 years later with 2006 Casino Royale. However, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. This would also be the last film with the help of producer Albert Broccoli, who was a major force on the production end in bringing Bond off the page, being replaced by his daughter Barbara, who was born in 1960, shortly before Dr. No, and was essentially being groomed for the role from a young age, working on set as early as the age of 17 with Octopussy. She holds this role to this day, working closely with her stepbrother Michael Wilson, who also has worked with the franchise since Moonraker. Unlike most other Bond films before this film doesn't take on an Ian Fleming book title, rather opting to be named Goldeneye after one of Ian Fleming's estates, where he wrote several Bond novels. Goldeneye ultimately takes the franchise in a new direction, it would seem. This is probably the most jarring jump of tone, technology, and feel yet, where I would say Timothy Dalton's run was defined by its fairly complex spy narratives that are very much thrillers. I would say the first entry of Brosnan's run is much more a popcorn action flick. The closest comparison in terms of other Bonds would probably be Roger Moore, though that's dumbing it down a little bit because this is a pretty original era for the franchise as far as things go. The plot of Goldeneye is fairly simple. 9 years before the events of the rest of the film, Bond is on a mission with fellow 00 agent Alex Trevelyan. But when the mission goes south, Alec is killed. Flash forward to 1995, and Bond has a new status quo with a new M, modern gadgets, and a lack of belonging in this post-Cold War world. Bond runs into a girl, Xena on Top, who he quickly learns is part of a crime family called Janice. Meanwhile, in Serbia, our main Bond girl, Natalia Simova, is doing her regular programming duties with her pervy co-worker Boris when her base is destroyed by the weapon known as Goldeneye, but she manages to escape. Bond and M witness this through satellite, so Bond is sent to St. Petersburg to investigate. While there, Bond meets with On Top, who tries to fight him, and gets off to it sexually. So yeah, this film doesn't have much subtlety. Yes, there's a murderous fetishist named On Top. So Bond captures On Top at gunpoint, who takes him to the leader, who turns out to be none other than Bond's long-thought dead friend, 006 or Alec Trevelyan. Anyhow, Bond is incapacitated by a tranquilizer dart, and wakes up in the cockpit of a helicopter with Natalia in the back. The helicopter is armed to fire a missile at itself and blows itself to bits, but Bond makes it out with Natalia just in time. However, they are quickly recaptured, and they yet again get free, but Natalia is taken away by a Russian general, Oramov. Bond hijacks a tank and pursues them, eventually finding a train they are escaping on. Bond crashes the tank into the train and manages to get aboard and kill Oramov, but the train is rigged to explode while Alec and On Top escape. Bond and Natalia escape last minute and head to Cuba, where they meet up with Bond's CIA connection, Jack Wade, who gives them a plane. They fly the plane, but it crashes, and they bump into On Top, who almost kills them, but Bond manages to get the best of her by hooking her to a helicopter, which loses control and she dies. Bond and Natalia head to the Goldeneye satellite base, where they find out Boris is working with Trevelyan. Anyhow, they all fight, and Bond and Natalia win and escape, while the whole place blows up, killing Boris. So Goldeneye, like I said, and you can probably see from my footage, is a big step into the more modern style of filmmaking. I mean, even the opening scene drops the camera tricks and editing of previous installments for a CGI-created aesthetic, although the songs performed by Tina Turner in the cinematics are admittedly very nice. On top of that, this film has an overarching meta-narrative about Bond essentially being out of date and needing an update, with them saying,
"I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War."
And Bond trying to essentially use sex to get out of his problems, like he does when he has sex with his MI6 advisor at the start of the film. We also have a female N, which is also meant to signal that the times are changing and may be a metaphor for Barbara Broccoli taking over the franchise from her dad and making this more up to date with modern times. Well, modern for 1995, that is. I may be reading into this too much, but I see these as fairly substantiated theories based on the film as it's presented. Speaking of M, Judi Dench is great in the role, essentially pushing MI6 into the modern age, as she puts it, much like the film is pushing Bond into the modern age. And Samantha Bond, who, yes, shares a surname with our protagonist, is a good new version of Moneypenny, if a bit underutilized in the film. Desmond Llewellyn is the only returning cast member from the pre-GoldenEye era, which is a nice way to keep the previous film's legacies alive while pushing it forward. Getting back to what Dench said before, the movie has deeply rooted themes of the Cold War fallout. That said, while there's loads of meta-commentary in this film, it's at its core still a fairly light summer blockbuster, with admittedly very dated 90s stylings to boot. However, Bond stays similar enough to his roots to not throw off the overall tone of the work. And this plot was easier to follow and consume, and I imagine even if I threw this on in the background while I was doing other things, I'd still get the gist, whereas the Dalton films especially, that really wasn't an option if you wanted to get a lot of the story. 006 is a great villain, and it's nice to have an evil Bond, more or less, for Bond to fight, and the twist that he's a bad guy was actually really cool. Natalia is a pretty decent Bond girl with a decent amount of time to flesh her out, and then there's Boris and On Top. So Boris is your typical 90s horny computer nerd character that may just be a bit too silly, even with his death being pretty slapstick, and On Top is just too on the nose for me. I mean, she basically gets off by killing people during sex, and her name is On Top, and that's the character. It's just way too much. Like, tone it down a bit. Pierce Brosnan's good as Bond. I think I like him. I mean, he plays the part well, and he looks like Bond should, although they kind of made him sort of an asshole and then never really paid it off, so I don't know if they're going to go anywhere with that in the future installments. And his introduction is built up a lot with his base jump and everything, then he just pops down from a bathroom stall, and that's how we meet him. Like, what a lame way to introduce the Bond of this era. Is this also a meta-commentary on how Bond is poo-poo for being sexist? You know, think about it. Okay, no, I'm just digging way too deep into this shitty intro, pun intended. It's way too cheesy to keep making this too long. Fucking neighbors are being loud as fuck. Tomorrow Never Dies is Brosnan's second entry as Bond, and the first and only Bond film directed by Roger Spottiswoode. Interestingly, it would be the last mainline Bond film not to be distributed by United Artists, with distribution being handed over to MGM internally, then Fox, then Sony, and most recently Universal internationally. However, United Artists would have a spiritual revival under United Artists releasing, and this is going to be releasing the first Bond film under the revival whenever No Time to Die finally comes out. In other words, distribution would be passed around. However, that doesn't matter much for anyone that isn't a film nerd, as MGM and Eon still hold the copyright rights for all the films, hence the box sets with every Bond film are floating around your local stores. Tomorrow Never Dies isn't very good. It's not terrible or anything, it's just on the lower side of okay. The best way to describe it is a spiritual remake of The Spy Who Loved Me, but far less good. Think The Force Awakens to A New Hope in Star Wars terms. The plot of the film is that a corrupt media mogul, Elliot Carver, wants to start World War III to profit off of. Essentially, he is a modernization of William Randolph Hearst or Joseph Pulitzer. He's a yellow journalist, as they say. Anyhow, he steals a missile from the United Kingdom, and the act starts tension between them and the Chinese government. This will give Carver a lot of news to cover, and for some reason, exclusive access to publishing rights in China. So Bond hears about this plan through M, who is suspicious of Carver, but they only have 48 hours since the British fleet is deployed to counterstrike the Chinese. So Bond heads in, and it turns out Carver's wife Paris used to be Bond's lover. So Bond being Bond, he starts screwing with Carver's operation and screwing with Carver's wife, which puts him right on the radar of Carver. Bond manages to steal a US Navy GPS encoder, which was previously stolen by Carter, to confuse the British sub he ravaged and stole the missile from, which proves that he threw the sub off course into Chinese waters. Thus the British saw this as an unprovoked attack, and the Chinese saw this as an invasion attempt gone wrong. Meanwhile, Carver has his wife killed, which makes this a personal mission for Bond. As tensions grow, Bond meets Wei Lin, who's a spy for the Chinese, and they are forced to work together and bring a stop to Carver's plan. So they manage to track down his ship, where he plans to shoot the stolen British missile, thus destroying a Chinese ship and starting World War III. A fight breaks out and Carver is killed, and the missile blows up Carver's vessel, stopping the crisis in its tracks. I think the connections to The Spy Who Loves Me are fairly obvious. Bond has to team up with a spy from another country, who the British have a strained relationship with, causing tension between the two, while the sexual attraction and chemistry bleeds through, ultimately ending up in the two getting together. The ending climax is them on a ship, stopping a missile launch, with the ship ultimately being destroyed. Bond and the other spy end up lampooned at sea to make love or whatever. However, while a basic Netflix-esque plot summary will have you believe these films are pretty much the same, the tone is very much different. The best way I can describe this film's tone is that it's not too much different than a modern Fast and the Furious film, prioritizing action and adventure over arcs and chemistry. Both of the Bond girls feel underdeveloped. Paris is an ex-lover of Bond's, and apparently they were in a serious relationship. Well, serious for Bond, but why did she marry Carver? I guess he loved her or something, but they don't really explain it. Is this like her trying to get in? Is she a gold digger? I don't really know. How long has her relationship been strained to the point where she wants to sleep with Bond and then betray her husband? I don't know. They never explain this. It's moderately implied that she thought her husband would seduce Lynn, but it was slightly implied, and we don't see the characters interact enough to see Carver really being bad to Paris. She also doesn't do much but say she loved Bond and then dies, so when she dies and the movie tells you to be sad, I'm just not. Plus, it's not uncommon for a secondary Bond girl to die with little fanfare, and while they tried to add weight to this, it pretty much failed, and she's scarcely mentioned after her death, with Bond not really seeming affected by the loss of his apparent intimate ex-lover. Lynn, on the other hand, kinda just cameos for the first hour, and then does action shit with Bond for the last hour, but doesn't have much besides action to get us invested. These Bond films really need to take a page out of the living daylights and flesh out the love interests more, rather than just having them be there for no reason. For me at least, the quantity of attractive girls should not outweigh the quality of attractive girls. And it seems the Bond series to this point hasn't really kept that lesson in mind. If it's really important to see Bond sleep around a bunch, then just give him a throwaway love scene at the start, which might I add this film did. Elliot Carver in my eyes is a terrible villain. He is written to be a cartoon character when the corrupt newsman premise could offer so much more. Look at Citizen Kane, for example, one of the most well-regarded and celebrated films in history whose lead is a corrupt newsman. Now look at the nuance of Wells' performance and the decay of Kane's morals that makes Charles Foster Kane a good character. And it's not fair to expect that kind of character study from the villain of a Bond movie, especially not one in the Brosnan era, but I can expect more than this crazy over-the-top character of this corrupt newsman, a type of person who has and still does exist. See my William Randolph Hearst reference from earlier. If you're not a history buff, he's the guy who sensationalized war and stoked the flame of war, as it were, to sell more papers during the Spanish-American War. He's a real man who we know Carver is based off because he says as much in the film. And while the henchman in this film, Stamper, is just your generic Bond henchman, I really have nothing to say about him. With that said, there's good action, which is a plus, but it doesn't mean a lot when the characters in the story are trash. Plus, Bond feels more like Rambo than Bond, with him in the opening just running and gunning with a machine gun, killing anyone who dares stand in his way. I know Bond has plot armor, but at least in previous entries, if Bond's held at gunpoint, he's kind of screwed. Felt like Bond was a man, an extremely lucky man, mind you, who never fails a mission, but you feel a slight illusion of danger, even if that's unfounded. Here you know he'll be fine. He's just running around with a machine gun like it's nobody's business. All this isn't to say the film is awful. Like I said, the action is creative and fun, if a bit over the top, and Brosnan puts another nice performance in as Bond. They hinted at Bond being a relic of the Cold War, with Carver saying as much before handcuffing Bond and Lynn together, leading to one of the most fun action sequences in the series. But they kind of dropped it off after saying this, almost like it's something cool to say rather than an actual theme like they had in Goldeneye. I will say, I really liked the opening animation. The cyber theme was actually cool and aged pretty well, which is rare for what I would call radical 90s computer effects, which we would see a lot in the 90s and early 2000s, and it often aged like absolute shit. And the song by Sheryl Crow is a really nice Bond theme. Overall, it's a fun action movie, but don't go in with hopes of getting much more than some fun, mind-numbing action. The World Is Not Enough is the 19th official Bond film, again starring Pierce Brosnan as Bond, with director Michael Apted contributing directing duties for his first and only film in the franchise. The film is interesting and feels like they kind of wanted to call back to the Roger Moore era, which was a fairly welcome change, but kind of throws off the last half of this film into feeling pretty formulaic and honestly a little boring. The plot of this one sees Bond protecting a woman named Elektra, whose father died under MI6's nose after a bomb was planted on him. Turns out his daughter was kidnapped, but escaped, so Bond takes it upon himself to protect her and find out who's trying to kill her. Of course, Elektra and Bond develop a relationship, and Bond tries to track down our villain, who is named Renard. After Bond almost gets the jump on Renard, he is forced to escape with nuclear scientist Christmas Jones. Yeah, that name is pretty terrible. Anyhow, Bond figures out Elektra's actually dating Renard and fell in love with him while in custody, but he finds out too late as M is captured by her and Renard. Bond goes to rescue her but is captured, and Bond manages to escape and kills Elektra, leading to a heated battle with Renard on a submarine. With what else but a nuclear bomb on board and an explosion Renard hopes would disrupt the trade in the Black Sea. Anyhow, Bond fights and kills Renard and saves the day, and Bond makes love to Christmas, because Bond has to make love with women at the end of every movie. The first half of this film, up until the twist that Elektra is evil, is really good. For example, the opening scene, which is much longer than the traditional opening scenes, with this comprising of 3 scenes. Bond meets a Swiss banker, and all hell breaks loose, but Bond retrieves the case of the money he was tasked with getting. In the second scene, Bond meets the man the money belonged to, Elektra's father, but the money was booby-trapped and the man is killed. Scene 3 is an amazing boat chase after the killer of Elektra's father, who commits suicide to protect herself from the unknown villain that has orchestrated this whole plan. It's an interesting set of events that I think sets up a very intriguing plot ahead, and this is a fantastic opening, though it does sort of throw a wrench into the idea of a short Bond opening sting to lead into the film that we traditionally see. In this case, however, I don't mind. I have to say, it got me curious about the rest of the movie. When he meets Elektra, they do some gambling and things, which remind me of early Bond adventures, and it actually has a lot more of the intrigue from the Connery and Dalton era that I really like, rather than the more Rambo action we saw in previous Brosnan entries. We even had some Connery-esque action with the parachute snowmobile thing. Anyhow, once Elektra comes out as a traitor, and it starts to feel very Moorish, with a plot that has a basic, cheesy nuclear story, and submarine action, the whole nine. But while I like Brosnan as Bond, he doesn't really work as a Roger Moore Bond. He did great with the more Connery-based scenes, so it's a shame. But whatever, it doesn't ruin the film. But this was shaping up to be top tier, but as it is, it just ended up being okay. This would be Desmond's last turn as Q, taking the role all the way back in From Russia with Love. His little plot in this film is that he's essentially training an assistant to take over for him, who ultimately would. If this was going to be his last turn, however, we don't know, since a month after the release of this film, he'd pass away due to a head-on car crash. Certainly, he had an amazing run in the role, with it unlikely that any Bond actor will ever top the number of films he's had a hand in. The Bond girls are a mixed bag. I like Elektra, she's a decent Bond girl, and even though the twist that she's evil feels a bit like a redo of the twist from Goldeneye, it's still a surprising and strong twist. Sadly, it feels like Christmas was just thrown into the film to replace Elektra. She doesn't get much time to actually make herself a good Bond girl. As it is, she's fine, but pretty meh, honestly. I could do without her. This also extends to Renard, who's ultimately the main villain of the film, but gets pretty sidelined in favor of Elektra for 3/4 of the plot, and it makes this plot feel hobbled together by the end of the film, especially after Elektra died. I do like his little gimmick of not being able to feel pain, and he looks cool, but that doesn't save him from mediocrity, and ultimately he just comes off as a very generic villain. The opening with the oil was pretty cool, and has a nice cinematic. The song by Garbage, the band, not calling them garbage, was good enough. All in all, it's a mixed bag, but I don't hate it. Die Another Day is the final film in the original James Bond series before the hard reboot through Casino Royale. Again, starring Brosnan as Bond, this would be the only film directed by Lee Tamahori. If I was able to summarize this film and say nothing else, you would likely assume it's a pretty decent movie, because conceptually this film has a lot of pretty good Bond material. However, once you watch the film and how it's actually executed, the whole thing kind of falls apart. The plot goes as follows. While on a mission to North Korea, Bond is captured for a whole year, after presumably killing Tan Sun Moon, who is the son of General Moon, a general in North Korea. After a whole year of capture, Bond is released back into the custody of MI6, as North Korea wanted to trade him for Zhao, a member of Tan's posse of weapons dealers and terrorists attempting to disrupt a China-South Korea summit. Once freed, Bond wants revenge, but M isn't having it, so Bond, much like he did in License to Kill, or Ethan Hunt does in every Mission Impossible film, goes rogue. His first lead takes him to Cuba, where he meets Jinx and learns of an up-and-coming diamond mogul, Gustav Graves. He meets with Graves and inquires about his diamond business and shows him one of his diamonds he acquired in Cuba that looks similar to conflict diamonds. Gustav challenges Bond to a sword fight, which Bond wins. This prompts Gustav to invite Bond to a gala at his ice palace in Iceland. There, Gustav shows off his satellite technology, Icarus, which he has made out of diamonds, that can warm places on Earth, essentially creating a second sun, as he describes it. After this, Bond starts an affair with Amanda Frost, an MI6 agent tasked with spying on Gustav, and who else is at the party but Jinx, who turns out to be working for the NSA on the same case. Bond snoopes around but eventually is captured after it turns out Frost was a triple agent who was undercover spying on Gustav, who, while undercover spying on Gustav, joined Gustav. And as it turns out, Gustav was the thought to be deceased Tan Sun Moon. Anyways, Bond manages to escape before being killed, escaping back to the visibility-enhanced Aston Martin. and he saves the also captured Jinx from drowning. The pair are then recruited by the NSA and MI6 to defeat Moon, or Gustav, or whatever you want to call him at this point. So a big fight on the plane ensues, and Gustav is trying to use Icarus to burn the demilitarized zone and start a war between North and South Korea, planning to use Icarus to destroy any nukes that the South Koreans or USA could launch, taking the world hostage from the sky, essentially. Whatever though, because Bond and Jinx kill Gustav and Frost, and this stops Icarus and saves the day. So like I was saying, I don't actually hate most of the concepts in this film, it's just the execution is so far from good. I think it's my least favorite film I've seen in the series so far. You can take this film down pretty much beat by beat. The opening chase was pretty cool, but with that said, it doesn't feel very Bondish, and it's shot more like an Expendables movie. And if I didn't know better, I wouldn't have even guessed this was a Bond scene. The opening cinematics are the cheesiest early 2000s crap I've ever seen, with my least favorite Bond song, belted out by Madonna. I can't get over these effects. Some of them look like free plugins for Adobe Premiere. Hell, the editing in the film in general screams early 2000 and not in a good way. And the car chase against the super-powered villain car should have been cool, but again, the editing was so dog shit. Speaking of cars, I know Bond has a lot of crazy gadgets, like the underwater car, but at least that takes some skill, like a sub could take out the car or something. Bond's invisible Aston Martin only got defeated because a snowmobile happened to crash into it. This is so overpowered, and anyone could do cool things with it, not just someone like Bond. Kinda takes away Bond's charm when he has, for lack of a better term, such an OP gadget. And the CGI in this film is so bad. I know it's a product of its time, and I'm sure at the time it looked okay, but look at these lasers.
This mine is fake, but the lasers are real.
Or when Bond surfs off an iceberg. But here's the most damning example. Look at this shot from the living daylights. Let's look at this movie's plane scene that also took place during the climax. And why is our main villain dressed up in a RoboCop cosplay to Wii Motion Plus control the Icarus satellite? He looks stupid and his costume's bad. Tell me who wore it better, Gustav 18 years ago or RoboCop 33 years ago? I even like the idea of Jinx, a cool American female Bond equivalent, but she's captured like 3 times and is constantly bailed out by Bond. And she says a yo mama joke, which of course she did because this was 2002.
Who sent you?
Your mama.
This film really gives me Batman and Robin vibes. I don't know if it's that they both have a huge ice motif, what with the diamonds, the main henchwoman being named Frost, the fucking ice palace, or if it's just the general tone. It's both, let's be honest. And both killed their respective franchises, leading to decidedly more gritty reboots in the mid-2000s. I suppose it's fair to say the late 90s aged quickly and aged badly then. Also, I don't know if the world wanted to see crap like this post 9/11, what with our edgy media phase quickly ushering in, but I digress. There's actually a fair few things I did like in this film. It was cool seeing a dirty, unkempt, beard-ridden Bond, something the series never really toyed with. John Cleese did a nice job with the Q role, taking over fully after the death of Desmond Llewellyn, though this would be his only film as the main Q. Like I said, the idea of a female agent that is Bond's equivalent is pretty cool, and despite the whole agent-lover motif being covered a few times in this series, it's rare to see them in a role slightly more proactive than just damsel in distress, which while Jinx falls into that a good few times, she's probably still the closest we've come to an equal to Bond. And that sword fight scene is one of the best sword fights in cinema, ironically using less digital effects and more skilled shooting, editing, and timing. Something the rest of this film incredibly ironically lacks. And the twists were pretty good. I guess Brosnan's run really was the era of the twist when you boil it down. And while you can feel the twist coming a mile away at this point, it's still a pretty decent one. Overall, the Brosnan Bond era wasn't very good from a film standpoint, sadly, which sucks because Brosnan himself is a great Bond, and much like the other men who took the role, does a hell of a job. I feel like if he did Casino Royale or The Living Daylights or even something like Goldfinger, he would have gotten way more credit, but sadly his tenure came at a time when I feel the Bond franchise was having sort of an identity crisis. That's not to say Goldeneye wasn't good or that there aren't good elements in all these films, but it feels like a lot of the stuff that will stick with me from this era is the creative twists and Brosnan's great performance as Bond rather than the overall stories itself. Anyways, this would be the last film from the original Bond timeline, though as I've stated a bunch of times, I kind of take these films' timelines actor to actor, despite, unfortunately, our last image of Bond in the main continuity is Bond having sex with Jinx on a bunch of diamonds. A satisfying conclusion to a 20-film arc? You decide. As I stated before, Casino Royale starts Bond's story from scratch, fittingly starting with the first ever James Bond adventure, Casino Royale, which MGM and Eon finally acquired the rights to. Quentin Tarantino was spitballing the idea of directing the film back in 2004 with Brosnan, and this adaptation was meant to take place right after the death of Tracy Bond. Although it's unknown how much traction this actually had, since Quentin Tarantino couldn't work with distributor Sony Pictures due to not being part of the Directors Guild. Anyhow, this stars Daniel Craig, who wasn't received well during the casting announcement, being as he was blonde. Admittedly, he doesn't look like the rest, who more or less all look fairly similar. On top of that, he didn't want to play the character much like had been done before. Anyhow, the film was finally made with Craig in the part, and with Martin Campbell, who did Pierce Brosnan's first stint on Bond's Goldeneye, returning to direct. And truthfully, Casino Royale isn't just a great franchise film or a great Bond film, it's just a great film in general, packing loads of subtext, themes, and all from a view of what I would say is our most divorced Bond from the others. While Connery, Moore, Dalton, Brosnan, and Lazenby all have their unique tones, they all have similar through line of traits. They like beautiful women, but don't necessarily respect them or see them as equal. They're cool-headed, and they do it all crutching on their ungodly large egos. And that's not to say they're unlikable characters. I love Bond, and I love those performances. Without the previous actors being able to pull off the part so much, Bond would actually be an incredibly unlikable character. And while other Bond films dip their toes into fighting these notions about Bond, this film goes all in. At the start of the film, Craig's Bond shares all of these traits, except rather than being cool-headed and suave, Bond basically does anything his ego tells him to do. Case in point, in an early scene where Bond is chasing Malaka, Bond is trying to take him alive, getting mad at another agent for compromising the mission of stopping this bomb maker, since they needed information he has. But after a wonderfully constructed multi-set piece action scene, Bond is at gunpoint and knows he's failed his mission, so out of spite, Bond kills him and shooting a gas canister to escape. This not only throws us into the plot at an incredibly high pace, but it also shows us the big difference between this Bond and the other Bonds. He's a killing machine, driven by himself at the end of the day, and not really the greater good. All this told in one scene rather than a whole film like License to Kill more or less did. Anyhow, I'm getting way ahead of myself here, so let's take a step back. The film is at its core pretty similar to what we saw in the original Casino Royale film from the 50s, and probably the book. I don't know, I haven't read it. Bond is on a mission to capture a bomb maker, but he escapes, leading to the parkour scene, after which Bond kills the suspect and gets away, not before snagging his phone and seeing the word ellipses. Anyways, Bond uses the credentials he stole from M to trace the call, leading him to the Bahamas, where he stumbles upon Alex Dimitrios, who works as a middleman between Malaka and Les Chiffres, who you may remember from way earlier in the video when I talked about the previous two adaptations of this story. Regardless, Bond makes contact with the man and wins an Aston Martin. Mad about this, Dimitrios storms off, and Bond manages to seduce his less-than-happy girlfriend, who tells him Dimitrios is heading to Miami. He sees Dimitrios hand off a bag to another man, who Dimitrios hired, and after a fight, where Bond is held at knife point, Dimitrios dies. Bond follows the man to the airport, where it turns out he has a plan of blowing up the world's largest aircraft, owned by Skyfleet. Bond manages to stop the bombing and rendezvous back to the Bahamas, where he learns Dimitrios' girlfriend was killed, a revelation Bond is not shaken by, despite her death being a direct result of torture brought onto her due to her connection with Bond just scenes earlier. Anyhow, they deduced that the act of terrorism was a ploy for Le Chiffre to short-sell Skyfleet stocks, much like what people were able to do in the wake of 9/11, and M informs him of the fact that Le Chiffre is gambling with money of terrorists. Bond is sent with a banker, Vesper, and they quickly gain an attraction to each other, while simultaneously playing mind games to figure each other out. Anyhow, the gambling goes much like the other adaptation, with the added drama of Bond being poisoned and the terrorists showing up to threaten Le Chiffre, only to be killed by Bond. Bond loses the money, but Felix buys him back in at the behest of Vesper, who sees Bond's gambling as a way to fuel his ego. Bond ultimately wins the pot, but Vesper is presumed kidnapped, as Bond presumes Mathis to be the traitor. Vesper and Bond are tortured in the now infamous ballsack torture scene, but someone kills Le Chiffre and Bond and Vesper are freed. The pair fall in love and Bond plans to leave MI6 for Vesper, but as it turns out, Vesper was the traitor and not Mathis, and started giving funds to Quantum, a criminal enterprise, in order to save her real boyfriend. Bond pursues the group, and after a dramatic gunfight in an old building, the building comes down and Vesper dies. Bond comes to the conclusion that Vesper never loved him, but soon learns she tried to have him spared, and figured she would die, so she sent Bond the name of the man involved, Mr. White, and his phone number. Bond captures the man and says his signature catchphrase.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
As you can see, while the plot follows the general idea of Casino Royale, it modernizes it, with Le Chiffre working with Quantum instead of the Russians, a more detailed plot that gets going due to terrorism, and the thwarted terrorism attempt ultimately leading to Casino Royale and the private gambling party, which is the backbone of the story ultimately. This isn't surprising, seeing as in the post-9/11 world, we saw this a lot, especially in the early 2000s. This can easily be compared to Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, both having similar tone, with Batman questioning who he can trust, much like Bond, and ultimately leading to a devastating blow to their personal lives, creating the men they became. This film preceded The Dark Knight, but in a lot of ways, don't kill me for saying this, but this is The Dark Knight done better. To be honest, it's worth noting that both reboots came on the back of series lows, Die Another Day and Batman and Robin, which had similar late 90s campy tones. Vesper is probably the best Bond girl yet, with a lot of her screen time questioning not only this Bond specifically, but in a broad, more meta way, the idea of Bond itself. It's almost as if the filmmakers used her as a way to illustrate the larger subtext they were trying to convey. This of course makes the blow that she's the traitor even more surprising to Bond, who says,
"If you do need time."
Why should I need more time? Job's done. The bitch is dead.
The moment, which is almost a full regression for the character's arc. But after seeing that she did care, Bond starts to come around a little bit, and ultimately ends closer to where he was in the old films. It was all very well planned, and a lot of films that try to add arcs and subtext don't do this much. It's a pretty nice arc for a Bond film. Not to mention, Vesper's death is legitimately sad, even knowing she betrayed Bond. We know she did it to protect not only her boyfriend, but also Bond, ultimately dying to protect these men that meant so much to her. Even after Bond knows that she betrayed him, before she dies, he tries very hard to save her, and is clearly torn up by it, but ultimately succumbs to a rock-hard, soulless demeanor to block it out. The film strays far away from the Bond formula, having the gun barrel sequence tie directly into the prologue rather than being after the MGM logo. A less sexualized opening cinematic, which is great by the way, and has a kick-ass song by the late and great Chris Cornell of Audioslave and Soundgarden. Obviously, Bond is quite different, with this being a pseudo-origin for the character, showing him being instated as a 00 during the prologue. The overall more raw tone, less interested in spectacles. See the bathroom fight at the start, and much smaller cast. There is no Q or Moneypenny in this, just M, again portrayed by Judi Dench, who's great as ever. And we do get a nice little cameo from Felix, who's played by Jeffrey Wright, who's great as well. This film has great action, but still a lot of intense and painful stuff, like when Bond gets his ballsack messed up, or when he's poisoned and forced to save himself to then go back to the poker game in a well shot and intense scene, which also adds some drama and entertainment to the very long card scene, which I love the gambling stuff. If there's one thing I dislike though, it's probably the piss yellow color filter they use for the first hour of the film a lot. Michael Bay famously used this in the first two Transformers films, and I hated how it looked. It doesn't ruin the film for me or anything, but it just looks kind of bad. Overall, Craig's first entry in the Bond franchise was great and has me really interested to see where they go with the next film, Quantum of Solace, though my expectations for this one are pretty low, as I've only seen it once in theaters 12 years ago and thought it was awful because I remember the shot composition was way too hard for me to follow as a child. But perhaps I'll like it more this time, with that said. Quantum of Solace is the second film in the Daniel Craig era. It was directed by Mark Forrester and is his first and only film in the franchise. And while I think a lot of you probably expect me to hate this film, because most people do, hot take, this film's actually good. It's pretty good. Quantum of Solace takes place shortly after the events of Casino Royale, and Bond is still pretty mad about how everything there went down. You know, with Vesper dying and everything. After capturing Mr. White in the last film, Bond and M attempt to interrogate him, but are quickly attacked by another man in the organization, Mitchell, who was M's bodyguard for about 5 years before this event. After a chase, Bond ends up killing him. After investigating Mitchell's apartment, Bond is set off to find an accomplice they were able to track named Edmund Slate at his apartment. Bond is attacked by Slate, leading to Slate's death, rather than him being careful in capturing him. Bond is told he has a suitcase from the receptionist, believing him to be Slate. A woman named Camille Montes picks him up to buy the contents of the case, but as it turns out, Slate was supposed to kill Camille, so mistaking him for Slate, Camille fires on Bond, but Bond escapes and tracks her down to a compound run by Dominic Green, our main villain, who Camille, it turns out, is sleeping with to get the dictator General Medrano, who killed her family and raped her mother when she was young. Green sells her out to Medrano, who plans to have his way with her, and then throw her into the ocean, but Bond rescues her. Bond then follows Green, who enters a private jet with Felix and Greg Beam, his boss. They cut a deal to get oil from Green in return for protecting him from Bond and having the US ally with his company. Green goes to an opera where Quantum is meeting, and Bond ends up exposing the group, after this being confronted by Green. Bond escapes, but Green kills a bodyguard that is high up in the British Prime Minister cabinet thing, and Bond is blamed for the killing, causing M to send a woman named Fields to escort Bond back to Britain to be taken off the case. However, Bond sleeps with her, and they attend a party hosted by Green, where Bond meets up with Camille, and they flee, only to be pulled over and find out that Mathis from the first film is dying in the trunk. Oh yeah, Mathis was here too, though he isn't super important to the overall plot. Anyways, Mathis dies and Bond is sad because they were friends. So now Bond is really out for blood, escaping and meeting up again with Camille, this time going on a jet to find Green's oil stash. They're shot down and escape, but find out that Green wants to cause a famine in the area to destabilize the Bolivian government and make them essentially buy water from him at extreme rates. Bond heads back to the hotel where he finds M has personally come to collect him, and Fields, a relatively innocent bystander and office worker, was killed in a similar way to Jill's iconic death in Goldfinger, this time with oil instead of gold. So Bond goes rogue like Ethan Hunt and finds Felix, who reluctantly set up a sting to kill Bond as that was his orders. Bond convinces Felix to help him find Green, who gives him info and tells him to leave before he's killed. Bond does and travels to a compound where Green and General Medrano just wrapped up their deal. Angered with the bad deal he was forced to sign, Medrano tries to rape a woman, but is stopped and killed by Camille, who finally gets vengeance for her family. Bond defeats Green and gets information on the whereabouts of Yusuf Cabrina, the man who got Vesper to fall in love with him so he could get information and use her as a pawn of Quantum. Bond lampoons Green in the desert, telling him to walk to freedom, only giving him a bottle of oil to drink, mirroring the fate he set up for Fields. But M reveals he died by being shot, but Bond's delighted to know there was oil in his system. Bond confronts Yusuf, who has given a Canadian intelligence woman the same locket he gave to Vesper, clearly trying to extort her in the same way he did with Vesper, and Bond tells her to leave. Bond ultimately decides not to kill Yusuf, arresting him instead, effectively ending the effectiveness of Quantum and exonerating the exploited Vesper. The film ends on the famous gun barrel sequence, implying that Bond is finally back to his status quo, for real this time. Honestly, this film completes this really nice Vesper-centered Bond duology that I think brings the character out of the Cold War and plants him nicely into the post-9/11 proxy wars we constantly live in. In the first film, Bond is a weapon with no remorse and nothing to lose, and he gains something he truly loves through Vesper. By the end of that film, he loses everything again, and in this film, Bond is a killing machine with no remorse, but not because he has nothing to lose, but this time because he lost everything he had, reverting him to his more primal killing state, which I think is an interesting concept. Bond not killing Yusuf at the end when M essentially gave him the option, rather capturing Yusuf to unravel Quantum, shows Bond's complete, pretty deep 2-film story arc. A much deeper arc than we got before these films, and I really like that. On top of that, Camille's parallel arc is also fascinating. This film very much has themes of revenge, which can lead to a gory edge fest at times, which this occasionally does, Camille's fight against Medrano being a particularly personal and gruesome fight. I also like how Bond and Camille's kiss at the end feels more like a release for both parties rather than a romantic thing. Yes, Camille is a Bond girl of sorts, and so is Fields, but they're more of a means to Bond's character arc than anything else. Bond likes both women, and the death of Fields makes things even more personal and taxing, with the deaths of Vesper and Mathis still weighing on him. Yet Bond doesn't crack and kill Yusuf or Green, at least giving the man a fighting chance, where I think most Bond films would have just had Bond drop him into the fire and keep going like nothing happened. I really like the plot of this film as a follow-up to Casino Royale. It's great and honestly makes the pair feel like a 4-hour epic rather than 2 separate films. And I do like a lot of the creative directions Forster took in shooting things like the opera scenes, with the opera intercut with the action. It's disorienting, which feels purposeful, though at times a bit much. For example, the car chase at the start that cuts so quickly for no reason that it's kind of confusing to follow. It also muddles the stakes a bit when Bond escapes the opera because it's so shaky and hard to tell what's going on. I see what Foster was going for, I just don't always think it worked super well. I think the scene that he does best is the plane scene, which had quick cuts, but more Christopher Nolan quick, where I can at least gauge what's going on, where at times this feels unnecessarily disorienting, which can be a pain to watch. I really like Green as a villain. I know I say a lot of these villains are realistic, but he very much feels like an early 2000s villain using oil to control the British and US government, which, let's face it, the War on Terror was pretty much just as much about us liberating the Middle East and foiling terrorist groups as it was to gathering as much oil as humanly possible. And the fact that at times both the British and the US are going for it really makes you wonder who the good side is more than ever in a Bond film. Again, this isn't your Cold War era Bond film. It very much plays into the domestic fears of the early 2000s, where things were more gray rather than the black and white nuclear fears of the 60s through the 80s. That is also why I think the symbolism of Fields' death is even more powerful, seeing that most people instantly think of Jill's death, a woman killed by a man obsessed with gold, and Fields was killed by a world obsessed with oil, which is also known as black gold, so it not only works as an interesting homage, but is also pretty good symbolism. Is this intentional? I genuinely believe so. The script itself is pretty smart overall. I really like the final fight, it's a lot of fun, and Felix gets a more nuanced and interesting role in this film, having to decide between doing what's right and doing what his superiors want, not too dissimilarly to what Bond is going through at the same time. I like that we see essentially a Vesper stand-in saved by Bond at the end, adding clarity to the audience that Vesper was a good person trapped in an unwinnable situation and is ultimately a victim. It also kind of validates Bond's happiness and love for her, which ultimately finally gives him the clarity to be less angry and vindictive by the end, ultimately not getting revenge and realizing that won't do anything to help him. It's really, really fucking good. And finally, the opening had cool cinematics, but the Alicia Keys' Jack White song was pretty meh. Overall, I'd recommend watching this again, marathon it with Casino Royale, and I think you'll get more of an appreciation out of it. Skyfall takes a step away from the Vesper duology and focuses on a more reliable and established Bond and his relationship with M, his mentor and mother figure. Directed by Sam Mendes in his first of 2 Bond films, a filmmaker I really like, with 1917, his most recent film, being one of my favorite films of 2019. This was the 7th highest grossing film at the time of its release, making over $1 billion. 8 years later, it's number 28, but I guess that's the Hollywood money-making machine we've had over the last decade. Anyways, I'm mixed on Skyfall. Very mixed. If I graded this film solely on its visual merits, I would say it's probably the best Bond film by a landslide. If I judged it by plot, it would be pretty mid-tier. Honestly, this film kind of suffers from that post-2012 Dark Knight trappings a lot of films fell into in its own ways. Interestingly, where I think Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace came to these conclusions independently of The Dark Knight, I think this film is pretty clearly more based on The Dark Knight, with the set pieces being all the rage, and a villain with a philosophy outweighing a villain with a realistic plan or purpose. In a lot of ways, if it wasn't for Mendez's impressive visuals, I don't know how much I would have liked this film. The plot follows the structure of your average Bond film more than the first two entries' pseudo-origin film approach. Bond is on a mission to retrieve a stolen flash drive with the names and aliases of several NATO agents on it, but while pursuing the thief, he's shot and presumed dead. 3 months later, Bond is hiding out and enjoying a break from the spy game after having felt betrayed by M. But this is quickly shattered when MI6's Bond and the names of agents begin leaking. So Bond follows the trail of Patrice, who he was pursuing at the start of the film, and tries to question him. However, Patrice commits suicide. But Bond witnesses a woman, Séverine, who he bumps into again at Casino Marcu, which he ends up going to after finding a casino chip in Patrice's things. And after talking, Séverine agrees to bring Bond to her employer, who's our main villain, Raul Silva, who captures Bond and kills Séverine. But Bond escapes and captures Silva. But that was only part of Silva's plan, who wanted to be captured so that he could hack Q's equipment so he could break out and have Bond chase him while he was in a police disguise on his way to kill M, who's on trial for mishandling the case of Silva. But Silva blows up a thing that was planted so a train car can hit Bond, but it doesn't, and Silva tries to shoot up the hearing but fails to kill M. Bond and M go to Bond's childhood home, Skyfall, and Silva follows. They fight, and both Silva and M die after the complete destruction of Skyfall. Cut to Bond at MI6, and everything is essentially like it was in the old film, with M and Moneypenny in a similar office to the one from the Connery era, and Bond ready to do his old school Bond stuff. So yeah, my biggest issue is probably the villain and his plan. He certainly has that very Joker feel, which I guess ties in pretty well with the idea of M facing the sins of her past throughout, but he's a bit too much of an agent of chaos per se.
Upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. I'm an agent of chaos.
This whole film's plot is motivated on getting revenge for M, in the most convoluted way humanly possible. I get he wanted to ruin her legacy and then kill her, but everything has to go constantly right for him to an annoying degree for any of it to work out. I mean, from the first scene, Bond had to fail his mission, which he almost didn't, and then M also had to make a bad call to have him shot. Then Bond had to actually be alive so Bond could track him down for him to be captured, whilst M appears in front of the courts for her malpractice during the case that Bond was part of. Keep in mind, only Bond could do this because the physical evidence found on his body that led him to Patrice. I don't know how any other agents would have possibly tracked down Silva. Patrice himself then needed the evidence that led Bond to Séverine, which I don't know if that was part of his plan. Who needed to want an out from Silva to even get her to try to get Bond to help her to meet Silva, and then Bond needed to agree to go to the island to kill Silva, but then Bond needed his radio receiver that he got from Q and needed to kill all of Silva's guards to capture him and take him to M, so that his plan, which he planned for years, could possibly pan out. On top of that, though, you also have to consider the 4D chess that he must have played to pan out, where he hired those 2 police officers to bring him the uniform in time. The explosives were planted right in the perfect spot so the train would land on Bond. His whole plan makes very little sense, and it's kind of just set piece after set piece. Beyond that, though, he's amazingly well acted by Javier Bardem and is a fun counterweight to Bond, a la Trevlon from Goldeneye. As I've stated, this film is very pretty. Rather than explaining this, let me just play some cool looking clips for you guys. I like that this film takes place in London more than a lot of these other films. London is often overcast and dreary in this film, implying some grim state of MI6. London may not be that cool to a domestic Bond fan, but over here in America, the land of the cornfield, I always feel seeing London's weird-ass egg building and Ferris wheel to be pretty neat. The climax and the action in general is great. Kincaid, who they introduce at the end, is a fun father figure to Bond and plays off Craig very well as if they were old pals, and it's a very easy to buy relationship. Speaking of, the new M, played by Ralph Fiennes, is great, and in this film he feels pretty Bernard Lee-ish, and is still a bit in the background to focus more on Dench, which I respect. Q is more of a hipster cool guy hacker, portrayed by Ben Whishaw. He's young and far less flashy than the take we saw with Llewell, but I like the modernization of the character, and Llewell's version wouldn't work super well in the Craig era, so overall I enjoyed the take they went with. I also like the new Miss Moneypenny, played by Naomi Harris, who gets to be a tough field agent as well as a good assistant to Bond. I like what they were going with these reimagined takes of the core Bond allies. This film has a nice Adele theme with very cool opening cinematics. Overall, Skyfall is stylistically amazing and it has a lot of fun, but the plot is kind of nonsense, with Bond's character not really advancing a ton, though I do like the stuff with Judi Dench's M, which her character expands well and gets a very good send-off for her 7-film tenure. The fourth Craig Bond film, and the most current at the time I'm writing this, and with the delays that keep happening for No Time to Die, probably when you are watching this, Spectre sees Craig return to the role, with director Sam Mendes back to take another crack at the franchise. And I have to ask, what's with all the hate on this film? Spectre is in a lot of ways peak Bond for me. Is it the greatest? Well, no. I still reserve that for Casino Royale, but I think much like the other Craig entries, so far it's really good. I mean, this is not the action-packed Bond you might expect, but I suppose we'll get down to the nitty-gritty in a moment. Bond is sent by Judi Dench's M to kill Marco Sakara, which sends him down a rabbit hole that leads him to investigate Spectre, who he finds out is led by his former adoptive brother, Franz Oberhauser, or Blofeld. Meanwhile, C of MI5 has the 00 program shut down due to Bond's off-the-book actions combined with the out-of-date techniques the organization uses. Anyhow, Bond meets up with Madeline, the daughter of Mr. White, who was a key player in Quantum in the last few films, and as we find out, he played a role in Spectre before leaving the group. Bond and Blofeld pretty much have a battle of wits, country to country, until it comes to a head in London where Bond manages to capture Blofeld. The plot has a lot more little moments throughout, but that's the gist of it. I guess I better start out with the characters. Madeline is the new Bond girl and Mr. White's daughter. Bond and her grow a quick connection, but she's kind of on the fence with Bond due to his occupation. I like her quite a bit, not as much as Vesper from Casino Royale or Kara from The Living Daylights, but I kind of dig the idea of one of Bond's former adversaries' children playing his love interest, and the attraction feels fairly natural as well. Seydoux and Craig play off each other very nicely. Blofeld, much like Dr. Evil in Austin Powers, is Bond's brother, and I don't really mind this twist as they're adopted siblings, and it makes Blofeld's anger towards Bond fairly understandable, what with Blofeld's father taking to Bond more than Blofeld. Now, is it the biggest coincidence in the world that the best spy in the world was adopted by the father of the best criminal mastermind in the world? Sure, but it really doesn't take me out of the film. I really dig Christoph Waltz in the role. I like how he starts mysterious but slowly reveals himself over the course of the film. He feels almost omnipresent and godly at first, which I think is an amazing take on the character. C, played by Andrew Scott, wants stronger surveillance to replace the spy game, as it were, so he teams up with Spectre to complete his plan. I love Andrew Scott and everything I've seen him in, which is unfortunately less than I would like. So I like the character just for how the actor plays him, but I will admit he's a bit lacking, as so much of the time was given to Blofeld, Bond, and Madeline's story that Mr. C kind of falls behind. Mr. Hinks, as played by Dave Bautista, was good as well. He kind of gives me Bane from The Dark Knight Rises vibes, which is fine with me, especially for a henchman role, and I dig the character for what he offers the film, even though it may not be as much as I would like. Otherwise, this film is much more of a typical Bond story. It feels a lot like a Sean Connery film brought into the modern day, with Q, M, and Moneypenny feeling like modern takes on the roles Lee, Llewell, and Maxwell helped carve out in those films from the 60s. Craig even feels a little more like Connery's take in this one, which I don't mind. I love those films quite a bit as well. This is also probably the best shot Bond film in the series. Each scene is beautifully lit, shot, and edited, and it's hard to say that Sam Mendes doesn't know how to shoot a pretty film. With that, the opening cinematic is pretty nice, though it's far from the series' most memorable, and I can pretty much say the same thing about Sam Smith's theme song for the film. Overall, I quite like this film. I know a lot of people don't, but I feel like it kind of continues where the Vesper duology left off, whereas Skyfall feels much more like a standalone adventure, and I like that quite a bit. I mean, I suppose part of it's based on the taste, like, I really enjoy Vesper and Bond's story in the Craig series, so seeing that continued in Spectre was pretty satisfying for me, where something like Skyfall being more standalone, while I do appreciate that for casual watching, isn't necessarily as satisfying from a story perspective to me. Well, there you go. Those are my thoughts on all of the Bond films, official or not, as well as Operation Kid Brother. This experience for me has been pretty amazing, if I'm being honest. Each generation of Bond is led by fantastic leading men, and they each have their own quirks and charm, which leads to a very strong series of movies that doesn't really get stale due to the slight variation between the many directors, writers, producers, and actors that always manage to keep the series pretty fresh. No Time to Die will come out eventually, when this world becomes less hellish, and we'll see a conclusion to the Daniel Craig series, which I'm looking forward to, as Craig has been my Bond since I was 8 years old about, and now in my early 20s, or late 20s by the time the new series starts, and I'm excited to see where they go with the next iteration of the character. That is the beauty of Bond being such a long series. There's always something new to tackle and enjoy, but, you know, this has been a very long video. Been working on it since October of 2020, and I'm ready to finally lay it to rest. Put it out here for the 10 of you to see. Anyways, hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about this series, and I hope I convinced a few of you to check out some or all of this wonderful series. And one last thing. Once No Time to Die is released on Blu-ray, I'll do a review of it and toss it after this video in my Film Retrospectives playlist, so you can check that out on my channel, either when that comes out, or possibly in that playlist depending when you're watching this video. A special thanks to the James Bond Wiki. They helped me so much remember the sea of names throughout this series. Also, special thanks to Grant Newkirk, or https://www.youtube.com/user/AOPunkfan for not interrupting my video for once.
Did somebody say Austin Powers? Hey everyone, it's Grant the Hierophant here to ruin Connor's very serious video about James Bond with a segment about Austin Powers. Austin Powers is a trilogy of comedy films penned and produced by Mike Myers about an English spy from the late 60s. The films are all directed by Jay Roach, who some of you might know as the guy who directed Meet the Fockers and Dinner for Schmucks. Oof. The first Austin Powers movie came out in 1997, with the second and third coming out in 1999 and 2002, respectively. I should also mention that Austin Powers is a spoof series and parodies James Bond and other spy movies. When watching the trilogy again for this video, I noticed a few things. First off, I noticed that the first movie, Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery, was the funniest of the three and held up the best. The second movie, The Spy Who Shagged Me, was more or less a rehash of the first, only now it had a bigger budget. A lot of the plot followed the same structure as the first movie, and not in a comedic sense. In a way, this severely detracts from the movie, suggesting that they could not think of an original plot for it, which in turn suggests that they might have had trouble coming up with fresh jokes as well.
So Austin, what's the future like?
Well, everyone has a flying car. Entire meals come in pill form, and the Earth is ruled by damn dirty apes!
Oh my god.
The third movie, Goldmember, moved further away from parody humor and closer to reference humor, but thankfully not by much. Goldmember also takes inspiration from the first movie, with the plot being just as simple and just as much of a rehash as The Spy Who Shagged Me. The second thing I noticed was that the spy movie genre has plenty of things to make fun of and parody, and Mike Myers did a good job making fun of the genre. I got quite a few laughs out of International Man of Mystery and was surprised at how well the movie held up.
Russian intelligence, are you mad?
A lot's happened since you were frozen. The Cold War's over.
Well, finally those capitalist pigs will pay for their crimes, eh?
International Man of Mystery. So, let's start off with the first movie, obviously. Mike Myers did well when writing Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery. When watching the movie, it's obvious he's having fun in the role. There are plenty of funny jokes that still hold up to this day, which is something that caught me off guard.
Let me go around the table and introduce everyone. Frau Farbissina, founder of the militant wing of the Salvation Army.
I was surprised at how often I caught myself laughing at this movie. Comedy is hard to critique in any useful way, and I suppose I should let you know that in advance. Despite this, I'm going to tell you now, several minutes into my segment of the video, instead of moving this statement to the beginning. The reason comedy is so hard to talk about is because it's completely subjective. What might be funny to one person might not be funny to someone else. That much should be obvious.
My father would womanize, he would drink. He would make outrageous claims like he invented the question mark.
Besides the fact that this statement acts as metaphorical padding in the face of criticism, it's just important to keep in your mind as you listen to what I have to say about the movie. The plot is fairly basic for a James Bond spoof. There's a guy named Dr. Evil who is evil and wants to take over the world. He also has a team of evil people working with him who are just as evil. Austin Powers, an English secret agent type guy, usually foils Dr. Evil's plans, so Dr. Evil freezes himself in cryogenic stasis so he can go to the future where Austin Powers won't be a problem. Austin Powers then freezes himself too, and they both end up in 1997. Number 2, one of Dr. Evil's crew, has developed Dr. Evil's company into a massive multi-billion-dollar corporation while Dr. Evil was frozen. Dr. Evil comes up with a plan to steal nuclear weapons and hold the world hostage for
$1 million.
Oh wait, no, it's
$100 billion.
The movie follows Austin Powers as he locates Dr. Evil and attempts to foil him. Along the way, he's paired up with a sidekick in the form of a woman named Vanessa Kensington. Austin is captured and put into an easily escapable death trap with Vanessa, but then easily escapes. Austin Powers eventually catches up with Dr. Evil and, with the help of Vanessa, foils their plot. Dr. Evil escapes, freezing himself again, and Austin and Vanessa get married. During their honeymoon, they're attacked by one of Dr. Evil's henchmen. Powers defeats him, and the newlyweds get to enjoy their honeymoon. Dr. Evil vows revenge. When looking back over the plot, I shouldn't be surprised to learn that it's as basic as they come. Comedies rarely need a plot to work, it's more or less just setting a table for jokes to come. What makes this movie work is a combination of the setting, mixed with the characters, and how that creates comedic moments. It's a basic fish-out-of-water story mixed with the James Bond plot about an evil man trying to take over the world. Austin Powers and Dr. Evil are 30 years out of their time, and that plot point is mostly just used for delivering jokes. International Man of Mystery does well in spoofing Bond movies by turning classic Bond tropes into sillier characters and settings. The secret villain lair is done perfectly in this movie, being an underground base with tons of henchmen and a death trap that's easily escapable. Dr. Evil works well as a caricature of a generic Bond villain because he's comedically evil. Austin Powers works as a caricature of Bond as well, and in a sense is still more or less a Bond-like character at the end of the day. He's still a ladies' man despite his looks, and he's good at being an agent even though he's a bit of a goofball. Mike Myers was quoted saying, "Austin Powers was a tribute to my father, who introduced me to James Bond, Peter Sellers, the Beatles, the Goodies, Peter Cook, and Dudley Moore." So the character of Austin Powers is more or less a representation of all these things crammed into one person. A swinger from the 60s who loves to indulge in peace, love, and all that. Hear them out loud, and suddenly all these influences become obvious. The first Austin Powers movie is good. When it comes to comedies, rarely will you see any majorly innovative composition or camera tricks used, and this movie is no exception. Everything is shot flatly, and as I write this, I'd hazard a guess and say that the majority of the shots in this movie were shot at eye level. It should come as no surprise that I can overlook this for the sake of comedy. I'm guessing that their goal was not to make the next Citizen Kane. This movie is color graded, at least. It's not like they didn't put any effort into the visuals. Oh yeah, Seth Green's also in this movie, as is Carrie Fisher for some reason. Seth Green plays Dr. Evil's son, who is not exactly evil and is more or less just like an average teenager. It's part of the joke. He's important to the plot, more or less. Carrie Fisher is just a cameo, though.
Okay, well, we've heard from you, Scott. Now, you tell us a little about yourself.
The Austin Powers theme song is pretty catchy, by the way. I can't play it for you because YouTube would take the video down, but I'm sure those of you who have seen it are already humming. International Man of Mystery is almost a perfect movie if the humor connects to you. If one joke lands with you personally, then chances are you'll get quite a few laughs out of this movie. As stated, it's hard to talk about comedies. Either you'll laugh or you won't. Nothing in this movie is meant to be taken seriously or critically, yet here I am sat in front of a microphone trying to take a critical look at this movie. For a movie that only had a modest budget of $16.5 million, Austin Powers did well enough at the box office to warrant a sequel, The Spy Who Shagged Me. So after everything was said and done with the first movie, Mike Myers and Jay Roach were given the go-ahead to start production on a sequel. How does it hold up? Well, that's a bit of a trick question because it doesn't. So much of the second movie steals from the plot of the first. I'm not saying you can't do this well, but there isn't even a deja vu joke to justify their laziness. The only major change is the introduction of time travel, but trust me when I say this isn't as big a deal as it sounds. The first movie also had time travel, if you count cryogenically freezing yourself as time travel. But stop me if this sounds familiar. Austin Powers is enjoying his honeymoon when Vanessa Kensington starts acting weird. Austin finds out she's a fembot controlled by Dr. Evil. She self-destructs and he grieves for a bit before realizing he's single again and now he can have sex with whoever he wants. After a short opening, the movie kicks up and we start seeing more references in this movie than we did in the first.
If you just joined us, today's topic is My Father is Evil and he wants to take over the world.
Austin gets his mojo stolen by Fat Bastard, a new character who is also played by Mike Myers, and from here things start to sound similar. Austin has to track down his stolen mojo by traveling through time, only going backwards this go around, and finding Dr. Evil. Dr. Evil drinks some of Austin's mojo and has sex with Frau Farbissina. It may not seem plot crucial, but it kind of is, since this is how Seth Green's character is born. Austin and his new sidekick, Felicity Shagwell, track down Fat Bastard and find out Dr. Evil is on an island in the Caribbean. They then go to this island and set up a tent. This has one of the more memorable jokes of the movie, where Austin and Felicity are in a tent and the shadows make it look like she's pulling stuff out of his butt. They're taken prisoner by Dr. Evil's henchmen and now put in a death trap they can easily escape from. They catch up to Dr. Evil and his new sidekick Mini-Me on their evil moon base. On this base, they get separated and eventually, after fighting Mini-Me, Austin catches up with Dr. Evil. Evil has captured Felicity and Austin has to choose between saving her or saving the world. He saves the world and Felicity dies. Realizing he can time travel, he goes back and saves her while the Austin from the past saves the world. The movie wraps up with Felicity and Austin relaxing in Austin's pad. Fat Bastard shows up but then is defeated by Austin and Felicity. After that, the movie ends with another Jerry Springer skit where we find out Scott, Seth Green's character, is the love child of Frau and Dr. Evil. Basically just the first movie, but again with a few new elements thrown in. Comparing the two, you'll notice that Austin gets a sidekick, has to track down Dr. Evil, and is thrown into an easily escapable death chamber, which he then escapes from, and then foils Dr. Evil. I'm not saying you have to drastically change the formula. This is a sequel, after all. I'm just saying that seeing these elements reused was a bit boring. Part of me thinks that new context for similar story beats might be enough to make the movie stand out on its own for some people, but that's just not the case in my eyes. A lot of the overall themes are the same, and the few reused jokes simply come off as lazy instead of referential. Maybe a better solution would have been taking a complete left turn when it comes to the plot. Make it about literally anything else. Structure is nice and coming back to old themes could still be done, but maybe with a wink-wink nudge-nudge mentality. Have Austin repeat a joke from the first movie and have several support characters chide him for it. Maybe have Austin fighting a new villain with the help of Dr. Evil. No, but better than that. Okay, my hands are a bit tied here. It's famously known in the writing community that there are only a handful of stories that exist and formats that can be used. You don't need to break the mold with a comedy about a spy swinger foiling a man literally named Dr. Evil. I guess I just wanted more from this movie and wasn't satisfied with what I got. Making movies is hard. Every single aspect of pre-production, production, and post-production are grueling and difficult in most senses. Writing a comedy is one of the most dangerous things you can do, since comedy is one of the most subjective things in the world. You risk alienating an audience when writing any comedy. It's just about how much you want to appeal to the lowest common denominator.
Let me look. Damn it. How do we get in?
Hello, Mommy. Mommy, can I have some chocolates? I want some Mars balls.
It should be mentioned that Mike Myers had a co-writer for this script in the form of Michael McCullers, famous for Undercover Brother, Thunderbirds, and The Boss Baby. Oh my god. There are plenty of jokes that are appealing to the lowest common denominator in the first movie, but they were few and far between.
Stage 5. Evacuation beginning.
It seems in the second movie that there were a lot more of these kinds of jokes. It only gets worse in the third movie, but I digress. It's weird to think, but all three movies deal with time travel in some regard. The first movie does it by freezing Austin Powers and Dr. Evil for 30 years. The second movie introduces a time portal, and the third movie introduces a time-traveling car. Spoiler alert. But at the same time, they barely do anything with the concept.
If you have a time machine, why not just go back and kill Austin Powers when he's sitting on the crapper or something?
How about no?
I fully understand that this trilogy does not take itself seriously in any respect, but they could have done quite a bit with time travel. Any writer can tell you that this concept is a can of worms in and of itself. Barring a few jokes, they barely mention it, which I suppose is a joke in its own way. Fat Bastard's voice is literally Mike Myers' Shrek voice. Close your eyes, listen to the shit.
Come here, I'm gonna eat you! I'm bigger than you, I'm higher in the food chain! Get in my belly!
I don't have much to say about the second movie. It did what the first movie did, but since the first movie already exists, there's no real point in rehashing it. Sure, there are a few fresh jokes, and some of the old jokes are put into new context, but there really wasn't a reason to make this movie, and there's even less of a reason to watch it. Part of me feels like saying that, oh, it's just the first movie again, is a cop-out, but I can't think of many other ways to put it. This time, the budget was $33 million, and the box office was $312 million. It was clear at this point that Mike Myers was onto something and he had struck gold with this series, so it was a no-brainer that they should then make a third movie. Goldmember. If you thought my second segment was sparse, get ready for the briefest of analysis. Goldmember is just the Spy Who Shagged Me, but with another Mike Myers character thrown in for good measure, the titular Goldmember. Also, Beyonce is here. Why? Pardon me for so lazily describing this movie, but at the end of our mini marathon, I was just out of energy and all Austin Powers out. Maybe it was a bad idea watching all of these movies back to back, because once we finished Goldmember, all of us were just drained and sick and tired of the series. It was a lot easier to point out jokes that were similar to ones that came before it in the first two movies, and the newer jokes just seemed childish and like they were trying too hard to be funny. That said, not all the jokes were terrible. The scene where Austin is reading subtitles is fairly creative. I can't think of many movies off the top of my head that did that kind of joke. Wait, Fun with Subtitles has its own TV tropes page. Huh. Speaking of, there's another joke before that one where Austin and his father are talking and they decide to switch to English, and then the subtitles have a hard time keeping up with them.
Yes, she was the barrister that became a bobby in a lorry, and they gave her the Gatling gun in the bottom of St. Regis tea kettle.
That got a laugh out of me. There was also a rap scene in the prison, which many people I know seem to cite as an example of why Goldmember is funny. The opening sketch about Austin Powers being acted by famous Hollywood actors was pretty funny too, made funnier by the addition of Kevin Spacey.
You better watch your friggin' self, because this is one doctor who does make house calls.
Again, it's not like the whole movie was terrible. Just most of it. Goldmember's plot is yet another rehash, but a few new elements are introduced, and I suppose I have to do my due diligence in mentioning them. The fourth Mike Myers character that's introduced in this movie isn't funny at all, but then again, neither was Fat Bastard. It turns out that Dr. Evil and Austin Powers are brothers, separated when they were young. The finale takes place on a submarine instead of an underground moon base. Some jokes are repeated, like a musical number coming out of nowhere.
From the moment I heard Frau say I had a clone, I knew that I'd be safe because I'd never be alone.
Some jokes land, but most don't. Again, this is all subjective. I suppose Austin Powers was more or less a passion project, so I can't fault Mike Myers for doing what he wanted to do. It feels like he's having a lot of fun making these, and at the end of the day, I can't blame him for making these movies. It's not really important, but this is the first Austin Powers movie that didn't have a colon in the title. Trivia! The budget was $63 million. It made $296.7 million at the box office. Looking at numbers like those, it becomes obvious why they made this movie. Comedies are often quite cheap to make, cheap as far as movies go, at least. So, making one gives you a better chance at making your money back at the studio. If the movie fails, you've only lost a few $1,000,000, and you might make that back with another project. All of the Austin Powers movies made back their budget. Not only that, but the cast seemed to have fun making these movies. I'm not going to criticize Goldmember for being what it is. A lot goes into filmmaking, and sometimes things just don't go as planned. Perhaps this was meant to be the funniest in the trilogy, but the writing wasn't as sharp and the jokes weren't as clever as the films that came before it. I suppose that's more or less the reason why this movie flopped critically as hard as it did, but even then it made more than enough money to justify its own existence. Possible fourth movie? Mike Myers and Jay Roach have stated that they both want to make another Austin Powers movie, but have been saying this for about 15 years. The future doesn't look so great for Austin Powers, but at least we have 3 movies to watch. Conclusion and wrap up. As far as comedies go, you can do a lot worse than watching this trilogy. There are hundreds of thousands of terrible movies you can watch, so finding something that's passable is sometimes worth it in and of itself. Austin Powers 1, 2, and 3 are more than passable. When all is said and done, I'd have to say that Austin Powers was a fun trilogy to re-watch at first. But the further we got into it, the further we seemed to realize that the movies were a lot better in our heads and our memories. Maybe they were a lot funnier when we were children, but that poses the question of whether or not your child should be watching these movies. The short answer? No. Obviously. Austin Powers is raunchy. No kid should watch it. Should an adult give the series a go if they haven't seen it before? Well, by all means. If the humor connects with you, then you'll have a good time watching them. I personally feel like a lot of the humor is childish, and the second and third movies especially fall victim into crude humor more often than not. In that sense, these movies would be a lot funnier the younger you are, so I suppose me, being 25 at the time of this recording, plays into why I don't particularly find Austin Powers 2 or 3 very funny. I also enjoy wittier humor, and I'm a big fan of dry humor, so watching a series like Austin Powers that's mostly about in-your-face, over-the-top comedy, it should come as no surprise that most of it didn't connect. What actually surprised me the most was the fact that I laughed so much at the first movie, when I expected myself to be more reserved about it. Thankfully, I proved myself right by being reserved through 2 and 3. Thanks, Connor, for letting me ruin your serious James Bond analysis video with my terrible analysis of Austin Powers. Once again, I'm Grant the Hierophant. I have a YouTube channel where I talk about games, old jobs I used to work at, and make shorts. A link will be in the description. Thanks again for watching. I appreciate it. Now, excuse me, I have some bleach to drink.